The crystal wine glass shattered against the Italian marble floor of the penthouse kitchen, sending thousands of glittering shards spinning across the polished surface like fallen stars catching the afternoon light. Margaret Thompson stood frozen in the aftermath, her manicured hand still extended from where she had released the Waterford crystal that had been a wedding gift 23 years ago from Richard's late mother. The sound seemed to echo forever in the cavernous kitchen with its granite countertops that cost more than most people's annual salaries, its restaurant-grade appliances that Margaret rarely used for anything more elaborate than reheating takeout, and its floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of Central Park 40 stories below. But today, that view felt less like a privilege and more like looking at freedom from the wrong side of prison bars. I said I'm not doing it anymore. Richard. Her voice carried the soft, southern accent she had never quite managed to lose despite 2 decades of living in Manhattan. Each word measured and deliberate in the way that meant she was holding back a hurricane of emotions that threatened to destroy everything in their path. The accent always became more pronounced when she was angry, a linguistic tell that Richard had learned to recognize and dismiss over the years. Richard Thompson didn't bother looking up from his Wall Street journal, his salt and pepper hair perfectly styled even at 3 in the afternoon. His Italian silk tie still knotted with mathematical precision, despite being home for over an hour. When he finally spoke, his voice cut through the air like a blade dipped in ice water, each word calculated for maximum impact with minimum effort. You'll do exactly what I tell you to do, Margaret. That's what wives are for. The casual cruelty of the statement hung in the air between them, like smoke from a fire that had been burning for years. Margaret knelt carefully to pick up the larger pieces of crystal, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to gather the remnants of something that had once been whole and beautiful. The wedding gift had been precious to Richard's mother, a woman who had died 5 years earlier, still believing that her son was fundamentally a good man who loved his wife. Margaret often wondered what the elegant Mrs. Thompson would think if she could see them now. Sophia is expecting you at 3:30, Richard continued, turning a page of his newspaper with the same deliberate precision he brought to every aspect of his carefully controlled life. Her downtown apartment needs a thorough cleaning before tonight's business meeting. I've already confirmed your availability and sent her your phone number in case she needs to reach you directly. Margaret's fingers found a particularly sharp piece of crystal, and for just a moment, she imagined what it would feel like to press the jagged edge into her palm until it drew blood. Physical pain seemed somehow more honest than the emotional numbness that had characterized her existence for the past several months. Instead, she placed the shard carefully in her other hand, with the rest of the broken pieces. Your mistress, she said quietly, not looking up from the destruction at her feet. Your mistress wants me to clean her apartment so she can entertain other men in a space that I've made spotless for her convenience. Do I have that exactly right? Richard. The question was delivered in the same tone she might use to confirm dinner reservations or verify the time of a social engagement. But underneath the surface politeness was a current of something that Richard had learned to recognize as dangerous. Sophia is a business associate, Richard replied, his tone suggesting that this was a conversation they had already settled months ago and that revisiting it was both tedious and unnecessary. A very important business associate whose continued cooperation is essential to several major deals currently in development. And you are my wife, which means you understand that these arrangements work best when everyone involved understands their role and executes their responsibilities without unnecessary drama. Margaret stood slowly, the crystal pieces cupped in her palms like jagged tears from a life that had been breaking by degrees for years, without her fully recognizing the damage. For 6 months, she had been playing the role of what Richard euphemistically called his domestic coordinator, which in practice meant serving as his millionaire ex-husband's personal cleaning lady while he conducted affairs in spaces that she maintained for his convenience. Each time she had scrubbed Sophia's bathroom or changed the silk sheets where her husband made love to another woman, Margaret had told herself it was temporary, a brief accommodation during a difficult period that would pass once Richard worked through whatever midlife crisis had led him to need validation from a woman 15 years younger than his wife. Each time, she had found new ways to make herself smaller, to take up less space in her own life, to apologize for existing in ways that might inconvenience the man she had loved since she was 29 years old. My mother used to say something when I was growing up, Margaret began, walking carefully toward the trash can, with steps measured to avoid the smaller shards still scattered across the marble floor. She used to say that a woman who cleans up another woman's mess is really just cleaning up her own life's biggest mistake. So, Richard finally looked up from his newspaper, his blue eyes as flat and calculating as a shark's. His expression carried the particular blend of condescension and impatience that he reserved for conversations he considered beneath his intellectual level. Your mother cleaned other people's houses for 40 years and died with $17 in her checking account, he said with the casual cruelty that had become his default mode of communication with her. I wouldn't take life advice from someone who never figured out how to build anything lasting if I were you. But then again, you've always been sentimental about failure, haven't you? The words hit exactly where Richard had intended them to, finding the vulnerable places in Margaret's psyche that he had been mapping and exploiting for over 2 decades. Her mother had indeed spent her life cleaning other people's homes, working 2 and sometimes 3 jobs to raise 3 daughters alone after their father had walked out when Margaret was 12. She had died 6 years ago with almost nothing in material terms. But she had also died knowing without question that she was deeply loved by daughters who would have moved mountains for her. She also died knowing that her daughters would never accept being treated like servants by men who were supposed to love them, Margaret replied, dropping the crystal pieces into the trash can with a sound like wind chimes breaking in a storm. She died knowing that she had raised women who understood the difference between being supportive and being subservient. Richard folded his newspaper with military precision, each crease sharp enough to cut paper. The action was performed with the same meticulous attention to detail that he brought to every aspect of his life, from his morning grooming routine to his business negotiations to his systematic destruction of his wife's self-worth. Is this about the prenuptial agreement again? He asked with the weary tone of someone forced to explain basic concepts to a slow child. Because I thought we had settled that particular discussion years ago. You signed those documents willingly. Margaret, eagerly. In fact, as I recall, you were quite grateful for the security and lifestyle they guaranteed you. Margaret remembered that day with painful clarity. 29 years old, working as a marketing coordinator for a small firm, madly in love with a successful businessman who seemed to offer everything her impoverished childhood had lacked. Security, status, a life where money would never again be a source of constant anxiety and fear. She had signed the prenuptial agreement without reading it carefully, trusting the man who had promised to love and protect her forever. I signed it because I was young and stupid and thought that marriage meant being partners, she said, meeting his gaze directly for the first time in months. I didn't know it meant being your employee with sexual benefits and no workers' compensation. It means being practical about the realities of wealth and success, Richard replied, standing and straightening his silk tie with the same precision he brought to adjusting his stock portfolio. I built Thompson Industries from absolutely nothing. Margaret, I provide this lifestyle, this apartment, your credit cards, your social standing, everything that separates you from the life your mother lived. All I ask in return is that you handle certain domestic arrangements that smooth the path for business relationships that benefit both of us. Domestic arrangements. As if asking your wife to clean your mistress's apartment was morally equivalent to asking her to pick up dry cleaning or schedule dinner reservations. Margaret felt something fundamental shift inside her chest, like a door that had been locked for years, suddenly creaking open to reveal a room she had forgotten existed. And what happens when you decide you don't need a domestic coordinator anymore? She asked, her voice steadier than she had expected it to be. Richard paused in the kitchen doorway, and for just a moment, his carefully maintained mask slipped enough for Margaret to see something calculating and cold cross his features. It was the expression of a man running numbers in his head, calculating profit and loss statements for human relationships. That's a conversation for another day, he said finally. Right now, you have an appointment to keep, and Sophia doesn't appreciate being kept waiting. She's meeting with potential investors tonight, and first impressions matter in business. I trust you understand the importance of ensuring that everything is perfect. After Richard left for his office, Margaret stood alone in the kitchen that had never truly felt like hers despite 23 years of marriage. The space was too large, too cold, too much like a magazine photograph, and too little like a place where people actually lived. Through the massive windows, she could see into other apartments and other buildings, each one filled with lives she would never know or understand. She wondered how many of those windows looked in on women standing in their own kitchens, holding pieces of broken things, wondering when they had become strangers to themselves. The apartment felt different in Richard's absence, as if the air itself became lighter when his presence no longer filled every corner with demands and expectations and subtle criticisms. Margaret walked through rooms that showcased Richard's success, but contained almost nothing that reflected her personality or preferences. The art had been chosen by his decorator, the furniture selected for its investment value rather than comfort, the books on the shelves purchased by the yard to create an impression of intellectual sophistication. She paused in the living room, looking at the formal photograph of their wedding that occupied a place of honor on the marble mantelpiece. 29-year-old Margaret smiled back at her from behind Richard's protective arm, radiant with love and optimism and absolute trust in the future they were building together. The woman in that photograph had believed she was entering a partnership that would last forever. She had no way of knowing she was actually signing up to slowly disappear. Margaret's phone buzzed against the granite countertop, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence of the empty apartment. The text message was from her sister Claire, and it contained only 7 words that would change the trajectory of everything that followed. Emergency sister meeting, my office. Now, come. Margaret stared at the message for a long moment, then looked down at her hands. Small cuts from handling the broken crystal had left tiny drops of blood on her fingers, and she realized that for the first time in months, they looked like her hands again. Hands that had once built marketing campaigns and negotiated contracts and created things of value. Hands that belonged to a woman who had existed before she became Richard's wife and might possibly exist again after she stopped being his domestic coordinator. She grabbed her purse and walked toward the elevator, leaving the remaining crystal shards scattered across the marble floor like evidence of a crime scene. Someone else could clean them up. Someone else could worry about maintaining the perfect facade of a perfect life that had stopped being real so gradually that she hadn't noticed when pretense became prison. The elevator descended 40 floors toward street level, and with each passing floor, Margaret felt like she was traveling not just through space but through time, moving away from the woman she had become and toward the woman she used to be. By the time she reached the lobby, she had made a decision that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. She was done being anyone's cleaning lady. Today would be the last day she spent maintaining other people's messes while her own life fell apart one small compromise at a time. The woman who emerged onto the Manhattan sidewalk was still wearing the designer clothes and perfect makeup that Richard expected. But underneath the familiar costume, something fundamental had shifted. Margaret Thompson was about to remember who she had been before she became afraid of who she might become. The elevator ascending to the 42nd floor of Thompson Sisters Enterprises moved with the smooth efficiency of German engineering. But Margaret felt like time was moving in slow motion as she watched the numbers climb toward what felt like her own personal judgment day. Each floor represented another step away from the penthouse prison she had just escaped and towards something she couldn't quite name yet, but desperately needed to find. Her reflection in the polished steel doors showed a woman she barely recognized despite seeing her every morning for the past several years. The designer clothes felt like a costume she had been wearing in a play she no longer understood. Hair styled to perfection for an audience that no longer mattered. Eyes that looked like they had forgotten not just how to hope, but how to see possibilities beyond the narrow parameters of the life Richard had constructed for her. The elevator chimed softly as the doors opened to reveal the reception area of Thompson Sisters Enterprises, the marketing empire that her younger sister Claire had built from absolutely nothing over the past 15 years. The space was a testament to vision and determination, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a stunning view of Central Park that somehow looked completely different from this vantage point than it did from Margaret's kitchen 42 floors below. From here, the park didn't look like something to be observed from a distance, but something to be engaged with, explored, lived in. Ms. Thompson, the receptionist said with genuine warmth that Margaret had almost forgotten existed. Ms. Reed and Ms. Walsh are waiting for you in the main conference room. They said to send you right back. Margaret walked down the familiar hallway, lined with awards and photographs that chronicled the growth of Thompson Sisters Enterprises, from Claire's one-woman startup to a marketing powerhouse that competed successfully against firms that had been established for decades. Pictures of Claire speaking at industry conferences, accepting business honors, shaking hands with CEOs whose companies had been transformed by Thompson Sisters' innovative campaigns. Margaret had attended some of these events over the years, always introduced as Claire's sister, the one who married well, as if her only achievement in life was successfully landing a wealthy husband. The conference room door was slightly ajar, and through the opening, Margaret could hear the rapid-fire conversation that meant both her sisters were in full crisis management mode. Their voices carried the kind of focused intensity that had built two separate business empires from nothing but intelligence, determination, and an absolute refusal to accept limitations imposed by other people's expectations. The psychological manipulation is textbook. Claire's voice carried the authoritative tone that had convinced Fortune 500 companies to trust her with their most important marketing campaigns. Systematic isolation from support systems, financial control designed to create dependency, gradual erosion of self-worth through constantly moving goalposts. We've been watching it happen for years, and we should have intervened sooner. The question now is what we can do to help without making the situation worse for her. Diana's more measured voice responded. As the CEO of a cybersecurity company specializing in protecting businesses from digital threats, Diana approached human problems with the same methodical analysis she brought to identifying vulnerabilities in computer systems. Any direct confrontation with Richard could trigger retaliation that leaves Margaret more isolated and vulnerable than she already is. Margaret pushed the door open and stepped into the conference room that had been the site of countless family celebrations over the years. Both sisters looked up immediately, their conversation stopping mid-sentence as they took in Margaret's appearance with the sharp attention of women who had been deeply worried about someone they loved. Claire, 45 years old and impeccably dressed in a Navy power suit that cost more than most people spent on their entire wardrobe, had the kind of commanding presence that filled rooms and convinced skeptical executives to trust her with campaigns worth millions of dollars. But when she looked at Margaret, her expression softened into something that combined love with barely controlled fury at the man who had systematically destroyed her sister's confidence. Diana, 48 and more quietly elegant in charcoal gray that complemented her silver hair, possessed the calm intensity of someone who spent her days solving complex technical problems that could bring down entire computer networks if handled incorrectly. She had built her company by being smarter and more thorough than everyone else in a male-dominated industry. But her greatest talent was seeing patterns that others missed. Margaret, Claire said softly, crossing the room in quick strides that demonstrated the energy that had built her business empire. Honey, you look like you've been through an actual war zone. I feel like I've been losing a war for years without realizing I was even fighting one, Margaret replied, accepting her sister's embrace with a gratitude that surprised her. Physical affection had become so rare in her marriage that she had forgotten how much strength could be transferred through simple human contact. Diana joined them, creating a circle of three that had been Margaret's primary source of emotional support since childhood. Growing up as the middle sister in a household where money was always scarce and their father's absence was a constant source of pain, Margaret had learned to be the peacemaker, the one who smoothed over conflicts and made sure everyone felt heard and valued. It had been excellent training for marriage to a narcissistic ex-husband, though she hadn't understood that at the time. Tell us exactly what happened today, Diana said, guiding Margaret to one of the leather chairs arranged around the conference table that had been the site of strategic planning sessions that had changed the trajectory of major corporations. Claire said you sounded upset when you called, but she didn't give me details. Margaret found herself telling them everything, starting with the crystal wedding gift shattered against the marble floor and ending with Richard's casual demand that she clean Sophia's apartment before the evening's business meeting. She described 6 months of playing the role of her husband's domestic coordinator while he conducted affairs in spaces she made spotless for his convenience. 6 months of telling herself that accepting humiliation was a temporary sacrifice that would eventually restore their marriage to something resembling its former state. Wait, Claire interrupted, her marketing mind immediately identifying the core issue that needed to be addressed before they could develop any effective strategy. He's making you clean his mistress's apartment like, actually clean it yourself, with cleaning supplies and scrubbing toilets and changing sheets. Among other duties, Margaret said quietly, her voice carrying the shame that had been carefully cultivated through months of accepting treatment that would have been unthinkable to her just a few years earlier. He calls it handling domestic arrangements, says it's part of being a practical wife who understands how business relationships work in the real world. Diana's fingers drummed against the conference table, a habit left over from years of writing computer code that required absolute precision and attention to detail. And you've been accepting this treatment for 6 months? I kept thinking it was temporary, Margaret said, hearing how pathetic the words sounded when spoken aloud in a room where two women had built business empires by refusing to accept limitations. I kept believing that if I just went along with his requests, if I proved that I could be supportive and understanding, things would eventually go back to the way they used to be, that he would remember why he married me and why we were happy together for so many years. Claire and Diana exchanged a look that spoke volumes about conversations they had clearly been having without Margaret's knowledge. Conversations that probably included detailed analysis of Richard's behavior and growing concern about their sister's psychological state. "Honey," Claire said with the gentle tone she reserved for delivering difficult truths to clients who needed to hear them, "you've been married to a narcissistic ex-husband who just hasn't bothered to finalize the paperwork yet. The marriage you're trying to save ended years ago. You just weren't informed that it was over." The words hit Margaret like ice water, forcing her to confront a reality she had been avoiding through increasingly elaborate forms of self-deception. She had spent so much mental and emotional energy trying to save a marriage that she hadn't stopped to consider whether it was actually worth saving or whether the man she was fighting for still existed. "The financial abuse is completely textbook," Diana added, pulling up information on her laptop with the efficiency of someone who had been researching the subject extensively. "He's using your fear of poverty and social displacement to control your behavior, making you financially dependent on his approval while systematically destroying your sense of worth and capability." Margaret thought about the prenuptial agreement she had signed at 29, trusting and deeply in love and completely naive about the legal implications of the documents she was putting her signature to. She had never asked for a copy of those papers, never reviewed the terms that would govern her life in the event of divorce, never considered what would happen if the marriage ended badly rather than lasting forever as they had both promised it would. Richard handled all their finances with the iron control of a CFO managing a hostile takeover. He paid all the bills, made all the investment decisions, controlled access to all the accounts that funded their lifestyle. Margaret had credit cards and access to household accounts, but no real understanding of their total worth, how assets were protected, or what her legal rights might be if their marriage ended. "We're going to give him a choice," Diana continued, her voice taking on the strategic tone that had built her cybersecurity company from a startup working out of her apartment to a major player in corporate digital security. "He can start treating our sister with the respect and fairness she deserves, or we can systematically destroy his business empire piece by piece until there's nothing left but a very expensive pile of rubble." "You can't do that," Margaret protested with the automatic response of someone who had been trained to prioritize other people's comfort over her own basic rights. "Richard has connections throughout the city, relationships with people who could hurt your businesses if they wanted to retaliate. He's not just wealthy, he's strategically wealthy. He knows where all the bodies are buried because he helped bury most of them." Claire laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. It was the laugh of someone who had spent 15 years competing successfully against men who assumed that being female meant being weak, naive, or easily intimidated. "Margaret, honey, we didn't build our companies by being afraid of bullies," she said with the confidence of someone who had faced down hostile takeover attempts and emerged stronger than before. "We built them by being smarter than bullies, more strategic than bullies, and more ruthless than bullies when the situation required it. Richard Thompson is about to learn that he picked the wrong family to mess with." For the first time in months, Margaret felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest, something that took her several moments to identify as hope. Not the desperate hope of someone clinging to illusions, but the practical hope of someone who suddenly understood that she had been fighting her battles alone when she actually had access to experienced allies with resources and expertise that matched or exceeded anything Richard could bring to bear. "What exactly are you thinking?" she asked, feeling like she was waking up from a years-long sleep. "We're thinking it's time for a comprehensive intervention," Diana said, opening multiple windows on her laptop that displayed information Margaret couldn't begin to interpret, but that clearly represented extensive research and preparation. "But not the kind of intervention he's expecting. Not the kind where we beg him to treat you better or threaten him with family drama. The kind where we systematically dismantle the foundation of everything he's built until treating you fairly becomes his only viable option. The sisters spent the next 2 hours outlining a plan that combined Claire's marketing expertise, Diana's technical capabilities, and Margaret's insider access to Richard's personal and professional life. Claire would use her extensive network of business contacts to investigate Thompson Industries' practices and relationships, looking for vulnerabilities that could be exploited through legitimate competitive pressure. Diana would conduct a comprehensive analysis of Richard's digital footprint, searching for evidence of business practices that might not withstand scrutiny from regulatory authorities. Margaret would gather intelligence from inside the marriage itself, documenting Richard's behavior and collecting information about his activities that might prove useful in divorce negotiations. The goal isn't revenge, Claire emphasized as they concluded their planning session. Revenge is emotional and unpredictable and often backfires on the people seeking it. Our goal is leverage. We need enough information and strategic advantage to ensure that you get a fair divorce settlement and that Richard can't retaliate against any of us afterward. He spent years conditioning you to believe that you're powerless, Diana added, saving files to an encrypted drive with the precision of someone who understood that information security could mean the difference between success and catastrophic failure. But the truth is that he's made himself vulnerable in ways he doesn't even recognize. Men like Richard always do, because they assume that the people they're victimizing are too weak or too stupid to fight back effectively. As Margaret prepared to leave Thompson Sisters Enterprises and return to the penthouse that no longer felt like home, Diana caught her arm with gentle firmness. "There's something I want you to think about over the next few days," she said, her voice carrying the intensity of someone sharing crucial intelligence. "You spend a lot of mental energy wondering if you're being too sensitive, too demanding, too difficult to please. You worry that maybe you're crazy or that everyone else can see something about your situation that you're missing or refusing to admit. But what if you're not crazy at all? What if you're actually a very intelligent woman who got caught in a sophisticated psychological trap designed by someone who's had decades to perfect his techniques?" Walking toward the elevator, Margaret realized that for the first time in years, she wasn't walking alone. The Thompson sisters had always been a team, but somewhere in the process of becoming Richard's wife, she had forgotten that being part of a team meant that the other members would never let her fall without fighting to catch her. The elevator ride down 42 floors felt fundamentally different this time. Instead of watching the numbers drop toward ground level, like a countdown to returning to prison, Margaret found herself thinking about ascending in reverse, about moving upward toward something better than what she was leaving behind. By the time she reached the lobby, she had made a decision that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. She would go to Sophia's apartment as Richard demanded, but this time she would be going as a spy in her own life rather than a victim accepting humiliation. This time, she would be gathering intelligence instead of just cleaning up messes that other people had made. The cleaning lady was about to have her last day, but Margaret Thompson was about to have her first day as the architect of her own future. The elevator to the penthouse seemed to move with deliberate slowness as Margaret returned home, her mind still processing the conversation with her sisters and the radical shift in perspective that had occurred over the past 3 hours. The marble lobby of their building had always been designed to impress visitors with its obvious expense and understated elegance, and Richard made sure to mention the cost of their monthly maintenance fees to anyone who would listen. But today the space felt less like a privilege and more like the waiting room of a very exclusive doctor's office where she was about to receive devastating news about her prognosis. The elevator chimed softly as it reached the 40th floor, and Margaret checked her reflection in the polished steel doors one final time, making sure she looked like the compliant, predictable wife that Richard expected to encounter when he looked up from whatever business he was conducting. Over the years, she had become an expert at managing her facial expressions, smoothing away any trace of independent thought or emotional complexity before entering spaces where Richard might observe and evaluate her performance as his domestic partner. The penthouse was filled with the low murmur of masculine conversation and the distinctive clink of expensive crystal glasses containing beverages that cost more per ounce than most people spent on groceries in a week. Richard was entertaining clients in the formal living room, a ritual that occurred at least twice weekly and always followed the same carefully choreographed pattern. Margaret could see them through the open doorway connecting the foyer to the main entertaining space, Four men in expensive suits discussing business deals over aged bourbon, while seated on furniture that had been selected by Richard's interior decorator for its ability to project success rather than provide comfort. Margaret, Richard's voice carried across the marble foyer the moment she stepped through the front door, demonstrating the hypervigilance that allowed him to monitor her movements even while conducting business with clients whose investments kept Thompson Industries profitable. Perfect timing. We need bourbon service, the Macallan 25, and change into that blue dress before you join us. The blue dress. 23 years of wearing the blue dress whenever Richard needed her to perform the role of the elegant, accomplished wife whose presence added sophistication to his business dealings without introducing any unpredictable elements that might interfere with the carefully managed impression he worked to maintain. It was a simple cocktail dress in navy silk that flattered her figure without being too attention-seeking, expensive enough to demonstrate Richard's success without being flashy enough to distract from his presentations. Safe, appropriate, completely forgettable. Margaret moved through the familiar routine with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed these same actions hundreds of times over the course of their marriage. Walked to the master bedroom. Change into the blue dress that hung in her closet like a uniform for a job she had never applied for. Touch up makeup that was already perfect. Check hair that was already styled exactly as Richard preferred. Arrange the bourbon service on the silver tray that had been a wedding gift from Richard's first business partner. Return to the living room with the appropriate smile. Serve drinks to men who would barely acknowledge her presence. Disappear back to the kitchen until summoned for the next performance. "Gentlemen," Richard said as she entered the living room, carrying the tray with the precision of someone who understood that any clumsiness or imperfection would be noted and criticized later. "You remember my wife, Margaret. She manages our domestic arrangements and keeps everything running smoothly behind the scenes. She manages our domestic arrangements. Not she's a former marketing executive with an MBA who gave up a promising career to support my professional ambitions. Not she's an intelligent woman whose insights and opinions have contributed to my success in ways that would be impossible to quantify. Not even she's my partner in building the life we share together. She manages domestic arrangements, like a very expensive piece of household equipment that required occasional acknowledgement, but no real consideration." "Mrs. Thompson." The clients nodded with the polite disinterest of men who had been trained to acknowledge wives as extensions of their husbands, rather than as independent human beings worthy of genuine attention. In their world, wives were pleasant background music, agreeable and decorative, but not requiring active listening or meaningful engagement. Margaret served the bourbon with the grace of someone who had been performing this role for decades, then began her retreat toward the kitchen as expected. But something made her pause in the doorway between the living room and the hallway, half hidden by shadows that allowed her to observe without being observed. Perhaps it was the conversation with her sister still echoing in her mind, or perhaps it was simply that she had reached some invisible psychological breaking point that made continued compliance impossible. Whatever the reason, instead of disappearing into the kitchen to wait for the next summons, she found herself listening to the business conversation with the focused attention of someone gathering intelligence rather than someone hiding from reality. "The Henderson development deal should close next week, barring any unforeseen complications," one of the clients was saying as he savored bourbon that cost more per bottle than many people earned in a month. "That represents another $12 million in development rights, assuming the zoning approvals proceed as anticipated." "The approvals are guaranteed," Richard replied with the smooth confidence of someone who had never doubted his ability to manipulate systems that other people considered fixed and immutable. "I have personal assurances from contacts in the city planning office. People who owe me significant favors and understand the mutual benefits of maintaining our professional relationship." Margaret felt something cold and heavy settle in her stomach as she processed what she was hearing. She knew enough about Richard's business operations to understand that advanced knowledge of zoning decisions represented incredibly valuable information, the kind of insider intelligence that could make or break real estate deals worth tens of millions of dollars. "Your inside track with municipal government has been absolutely invaluable to our success," another client said with obvious satisfaction. "Thompson Industries wouldn't be positioned where it is today without those strategic relationships. The competition simply can't match the level of market intelligence you provide." Success in real estate development is entirely about knowing the right people and understanding when to leverage that knowledge for maximum advantage, Richard said, and Margaret could hear the satisfied smile in his voice, even without being able to see his face. Information is the only currency that really matters in our business. Everything else is just paperwork and construction. Margaret pressed herself against the wall of the hallway, barely breathing as she processed what she was overhearing. In 23 years of marriage, she had listened to countless business conversations like this one, but she had always assumed they represented legitimate networking and strategic planning within legal boundaries. Now, listening with the ears of a woman who no longer trusted anything her husband said or did, she was hearing something completely different. She was hearing evidence of systematic corruption. Her phone buzzed softly in the pocket of the blue dress, and she pulled it out carefully to read a text message from Sophia that made her blood pressure spike with a combination of humiliation and rage. Darling, don't forget about this afternoon's appointment. The apartment needs to be absolutely spotless by 6 o'clock because I'm entertaining someone very special tonight. Pay particular attention to the bedroom and bathroom. I want everything perfect for my guest. Margaret stared at the message, feeling the familiar mixture of disbelief and degradation that had characterized every interaction with her husband's mistress over the past 6 months. The woman Richard was having an affair with was texting her directly, issuing instructions like Margaret was hired help rather than the legal wife whose marriage was being systematically destroyed by this relationship. Okay, the divorce papers should be filed by the end of next week, she heard Richard saying in a lower voice that suggested he was sharing information meant for a smaller audience. Once the Henderson deal closes and the profits are properly distributed, I won't need to maintain the marriage for appearance's sake anymore. The timing should work out perfectly. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow, forcing her to grip the doorframe to maintain her balance as her heart began pounding so loudly she was certain the men in the living room would hear it and discover her unauthorized presence. Smart strategic thinking, one of the clients replied with obvious approval. 20-year marriages can be extraordinarily expensive to dissolve if the timing isn't managed properly. But if you coordinate the end of the marriage with the right business cycles, the prenuptial agreement was written by the best lawyers money could buy, Richard said with deep satisfaction. She'll receive the house in the Hamptons and enough monthly support to maintain a modest but comfortable lifestyle. Nothing that will impact the business operations or create complications for future growth. Margaret felt the world tilt around her as she understood that everything she had been experiencing over the past 6 months, the cleaning arrangements, the systematic humiliation, the gradual erosion of her role in Richard's life, had been carefully orchestrated preparation for a divorce that Richard had been planning for months, without bothering to inform her that their marriage was ending. All those nights of lying awake wondering if she was being too sensitive about Sophia's presence in their lives. All those sessions of scrubbing another woman's apartment while telling herself she was being mature and understanding about Richard's midlife crisis. All those careful efforts to be the perfect wife who could save a marriage that was worth saving all of it had been performance in a play where the ending had already been written, and she was the only actor who didn't know how the story concluded. The conversation in the living room shifted to other topics, but Margaret could no longer process individual words. She moved through the penthouse like someone in shock, her mind struggling to reconcile the Richard she had loved for 23 years with the stranger she had just overheard, planning her dismissal from his life like a business transaction that required careful timing to minimize financial impact. In the master bedroom, she sat on the edge of the bed they had shared for over 2 decades and tried to remember the last time Richard had looked at her with anything resembling genuine affection. The last time they had made love without it feeling like an obligation that both parties wanted to complete as efficiently as possible. The last time she had felt like a partner in their relationship instead of an employee whose performance was constantly being evaluated and found wanting. Her phone rang, startling her from thoughts that were becoming increasingly dark and self-destructive. Claire's name appeared on the screen like a lifeline thrown to someone drowning in water too deep to see the bottom. "How are you holding up after our conversation this afternoon?" Claire asked without preamble, her voice carrying the focused concern of someone who had been thinking about Margaret's situation during every spare moment since their meeting ended. "I think I might be in some kind of shock," Margaret said quietly, glancing toward the bedroom door to make sure Richard's business meeting was still occupying his complete attention. "I just overheard Richard discussing filing divorce papers next week. Apparently, this entire process has been planned for months, and I've been the only person involved who didn't know that my marriage was ending. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds, and Margaret could practically hear her sister processing this information and adjusting her strategic thinking to account for a situation that was even worse than they had initially understood. "I'm coming over there right now," Claire said with the firm decisiveness that had made her successful in business. "No, absolutely not," Margaret replied quickly, imagining the explosion that would result if Richard discovered that she had been sharing details of their private life with her sisters. "He has clients here, and if he realizes that I've been talking to you about our marriage, it could trigger exactly the kind of retaliation we're trying to avoid." "Margaret, listen to me very carefully," Claire said, her voice carrying the authoritative tone she used in crisis situations that required immediate and decisive action. "You're not thinking clearly right now, and that's completely normal and expected. When someone you've trusted for decades betrays you in fundamental ways, your mind tries to find explanations that make the betrayal seem less complete than it actually is. Don't make any major decisions until we can sit down together and work through your options systematically." After ending the call, Margaret walked to the master bathroom and stared at herself in the mirror that reflected back a woman who looked perfectly groomed and appropriately dressed, but whose eyes seemed to belong to someone who had been hollowed out from the inside. When had she become a woman who apologized for existing in her own house? When had she started believing that keeping peace was more important than maintaining dignity or self-respect? The sound of laughter from the living room drifted down the hallway, and Margaret realized that while her entire world was collapsing around her, Richard was conducting business as usual. To him, this was just another ordinary day filled with profitable conversations and strategic planning. The fact that his wife was in the next room processing the destruction of her life's foundation was completely irrelevant to his immediate concerns. But for Margaret, this was the day she finally understood that she had been living in a marriage that had ended years ago, without anyone bothering to inform her that she was now inhabiting the ruins of something that had once been real. The day she realized that the woman who had spent 23 years trying to be the perfect wife had actually been serving as an unpaid employee in a business relationship that was about to be terminated for efficiency reasons. Most importantly, it was the day she stopped being afraid of what her life might look like if she stopped accepting treatment that would have been unthinkable to the confident, capable woman she had been before she became Richard Thompson's wife. The small cafe in Queens where the Thompson sisters had been meeting every Wednesday morning for the past 3 years felt like stepping into a different universe compared to the marble and crystal environment that dominated Margaret's daily existence. Tucked between a used bookstore that specialized in romance novels and a family-owned bakery that had been serving the neighborhood for 40 years, the cafe served coffee in mismatched ceramic mugs, offered free Wi-Fi to anyone who needed a quiet place to work, and maintained an atmosphere of casual warmth that felt revolutionary after months of living in spaces designed to impress rather than comfort. Margaret arrived 20 minutes early, claiming their usual table in the back corner where they could have private conversations without worrying about being overheard by other customers or photographed by the society reporters who occasionally tracked the movements of prominent Manhattan wives. The familiar sounds of coffee brewing, gentle conversation, and morning news playing softly on the television mounted above the counter provided a comforting backdrop as she tried to organize thoughts that seemed to scatter every time she attempted to focus on them. 2 days had passed since overhearing Richard's conversation about divorce papers and municipal corruption, and Margaret felt like she was living in a strange dream where everything looked normal on the surface, but nothing made sense when examined closely. Richard had continued his usual routines without any indication that he was aware of her growing understanding of their situation, though she caught him watching her, sometimes, with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. Claire arrived at exactly 9 o'clock, her marketing executive precision evident even in the casual clothes she wore for their family meetings. She carried a leather portfolio that Margaret recognized as the one Claire used for her most sensitive client work, the kind of projects that required absolute confidentiality and strategic thinking that could determine the success or failure of entire companies. "I've been conducting research since our conversation yesterday," Claire said without preamble as she settled into the chair across from Margaret, her voice carrying the focused intensity that meant she had been working on this problem during every available moment. Thompson Industries is significantly more vulnerable than Richard realizes, and his business practices are far more questionable than any of us understood. Diana joined them 15 minutes later, carrying a laptop bag and looking like someone who had been awake most of the night analyzing data patterns and digital security protocols. As the owner of a cybersecurity company that specialized in protecting businesses from sophisticated digital threats, Diana understood better than most how modern corporations left electronic footprints that revealed far more information than their owners intended to make public. Before we start sharing what we've discovered, Diana said as she opened her laptop and began connecting to secure networks that would protect their communications from potential surveillance, I need to understand exactly how far you're willing to go with this investigation. Some of what we found could have serious legal implications for Richard, and once we cross certain lines, there's no going back to pretending we don't know what we know. Margaret looked at both her sisters, women who had built successful companies through intelligence, ethical business practices, and strategic thinking that consistently outmaneuvered competitors who underestimated their capabilities. Everything Richard claimed to value in business, but had achieved through methods that appeared to be fundamentally different from the approaches that had made Claire and Diana successful. I want to understand the complete truth about what I'm dealing with before I make any decisions about my future, she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded when she felt like everything inside her was trembling. I need to know who I've actually been married to for 23 years, not just the version of himself that Richard has chosen to show me. Claire opened her portfolio and spread several printed documents across the small table, each page covered with highlighting and handwritten notes that suggested extensive analysis and cross-referencing. Thompson Industries' success depends heavily on advanced knowledge of city development plans and municipal zoning decisions, she began, her finger tracing connections between different pieces of information. But what I've discovered through my industry contacts suggests that Richard isn't just receiving this information early, he's actively participating in creating the decisions that his clients profit from. Diana pulled up multiple windows on her laptop screen, each displaying different types of data that painted a comprehensive picture of digital communications and financial transactions, spanning several years. The electronic evidence is even more damaging, she said, turning her laptop so Margaret could see spreadsheets and email threads that looked like evidence in a criminal investigation. Your home network automatically backs up to cloud servers that Thompson Industries pays for, which means I've been able to analyze years of Richard's business communications without technically accessing anything that doesn't belong to you as his legal spouse. Margaret stared at the screen, seeing her husband's business empire through completely new eyes. The data showed patterns of communication between Richard and city officials that suggested relationships far more intimate and financially motivated than anything that could be considered legitimate business networking. How long have you been able to access this information? She asked, feeling like Alice falling down a rabbit hole into a world where nothing was what it had appeared to be. Since you first told us about the cleaning arrangement 6 months ago, Diana replied quietly. I installed monitoring software on your home network to make sure Richard wasn't planning any financial maneuvers that could leave you completely vulnerable. I thought I was protecting you from ordinary divorce tactics. I had no idea I was documenting evidence of systematic criminal activity. Claire leaned forward, her expression serious. Show her the municipal corruption timeline. Diana pulled up a new screen that displayed a chronological map of Richard's business activities correlated with city planning decisions over the past 5 years. The pattern was unmistakable strategic donations to city council members' campaigns, followed by favorable zoning decisions, expensive consulting contracts with planning department officials, followed by development approvals that benefited Richard's clients, luxury trips and entertainment expenses that corresponded exactly with municipal votes that made Thompson Industries investors millions of dollars. He's not just predicting which neighborhoods will be developed, Claire explained, pointing to specific examples on the timeline. He's actively influencing which areas receive development approval, then positioning his clients to profit from decisions that he helped orchestrate. It's a sophisticated corruption network disguised as legitimate business relationships. Margaret felt overwhelmed by the scope of what her sisters had uncovered. She had known that Richard was ambitious and sometimes ruthless in his business dealings, but she had assumed his success came from being more intelligent and strategically thinking than his competitors. Learning that his achievements were actually built on systematic bribery and corruption felt like discovering that the foundation of her entire adult life had been constructed on quicksand. "There's more," Diana said, switching to another screen that showed what appeared to be stolen documents from various competing companies. Thompson Industries' marketing campaigns consistently use proprietary research that appears to have been illegally obtained from smaller competitors. They're hacking into rival companies' computer systems, stealing their market analysis and strategic planning documents, then using that information to undercut their bids and steal their clients. Casimardo. We've identified 27 companies that have been victimized over the past 5 years, Claire added, pulling out a separate folder containing contact information and correspondence. I've been reaching out to some of them through my professional network. They're very interested in what we've discovered, and several are considering legal action if they can obtain sufficient evidence to support their cases. Margaret stared at the evidence spread across the table, trying to process the reality that her husband wasn't just emotionally unavailable and systematically cruel in their personal relationship. He was also a criminal who had built his professional reputation through theft, bribery, and fraud on a scale that could potentially destroy dozens of other businesses and hundreds of individual careers. "How is this possible?" she asked. "How did he hide all of this for so long?" "He didn't hide it," Diana replied. "He compartmentalized it. Richard's been very careful to spread his illegal activities across multiple different types of violations so that no single crime would be obvious enough to bring down his entire operation. Tax evasion through offshore accounts, municipal corruption through strategic bribery, industrial espionage through corporate hacking, market manipulation through insider trading. Any one of these activities alone might have gone undetected for years. But when you map all the activities together and analyze the patterns across his entire operation," Claire continued, "the evidence becomes overwhelming. Richard Thompson isn't just a successful businessman who occasionally cuts ethical corners. He's a systematic criminal who has built his entire empire through illegal means." Diana pulled up financial records that showed a complex network of offshore accounts, shell companies, and international banking arrangements that clearly violated multiple federal laws governing tax reporting and financial disclosure. "The money laundering operation alone could result in decades of federal prison time," she said quietly. "Richard has been systematically hiding income from tax authorities through arrangements that are explicitly prohibited under international banking regulations." Margaret felt like she was drowning in information that redefined everything she thought she knew about the man she had been married to for over 2 decades. The millionaire ex-husband she had been afraid to leave because of his wealth and connections was actually a house of cards that could collapse with a single phone call to the appropriate federal authorities. "What do we do with all of this?" she asked, gesturing toward the evidence that covered their small table like pieces of a puzzle that revealed a picture too disturbing to contemplate. "That depends entirely on what kind of outcome you want," Claire replied, beginning to organize the documents back into her portfolio. "We can use this information as leverage to ensure that you receive a fair divorce settlement that recognizes your equal contribution to the marriage. Or we can turn everything over to federal investigators and let Richard face the full legal consequences of his choices. Or we can do both," Diana said with a slight smile that suggested she had been hoping Margaret would want to pursue the most comprehensive form of justice available. "There's no legal or ethical requirement that we choose between protecting your financial interests and ensuring that Richard's victims receive justice for the crimes he's committed against them." As they prepared to leave the cafe, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the sense that she had real choices about her future, instead of just different ways to accept circumstances that other people had created for her. For so long, her life had felt like something that happened to her, rather than something she actively shaped through her own decisions and actions. "There's one more thing," Diana said as they gathered their materials. "Richard has been planning to blame some of his cyber crimes on our companies if he gets caught. He's been creating false digital evidence that would make it appear that Thompson Sisters Enterprises has been hacking Thompson Industries systems. But what he doesn't realize is that we've been recording his creation of that false evidence for months." Margaret stared at her sister, understanding that Richard's attempts to destroy Claire and Diana's businesses would actually provide additional evidence of his criminal intent and systematic dishonesty. "He's not just stealing from other companies and bribing city officials," she said slowly. "He's also trying to frame you for crimes he committed, which means that everything he's done to victimize other people, he was also planning to do to us," Claire said grimly. The man who convinced you that leaving him would be financial suicide was actually planning to destroy your entire family if we interfered with his criminal activities. That evening, as Margaret prepared for another dinner performance as the elegant wife, while Richard conducted business with people who appeared to be co-conspirators in various forms of fraud, she realized that her role in these social events had been more significant than she had understood. Every dinner party, every social function, every appearance as the devoted wife had provided cover and legitimacy for criminal activities that had victimized dozens of other people. She was no longer just gathering intelligence about her own situation. She was documenting evidence that could provide justice for every person and business that Richard had systematically robbed over the years. The cleaning lady was becoming a detective. But more than that, she was becoming an agent of justice in a story that was much larger than her own personal liberation. The doorbell of the penthouse chimed with the elaborate musical sequence that Richard had programmed to announce visitors. Notes that had once seemed elegant and sophisticated, but now sounded to Margaret like a warning bell, signaling the approach of another humiliation she would be expected to accept with grace and gratitude. She was alone in the kitchen, still processing the overwhelming information her sisters had shared about Richard's criminal activities, when she heard the distinctive click of designer heels against marble flooring echoing through the foyer. "Darling, we need to have a serious conversation. Woman to woman, as they say." Sophia's voice carried the breathy confidence of someone who had never encountered a situation she couldn't manipulate to her advantage. The entitled tone of a woman who had learned early in life that her combination of beauty, youth, and calculated charm could open doors that remained closed to people who relied on more substantial qualifications. At 32 years old, she represented everything Margaret had been when she first met Richard: ambitious, optimistic, and naive enough to believe that attaching herself to a powerful man would automatically make her powerful too. The crucial difference was that Sophia had chosen to be the other woman rather than the wife, a strategic decision that she seemed to consider evidence of her superior intelligence and modern thinking about relationships. She had positioned herself as Richard's business partner and sexual companion, without the legal complications and emotional demands that came with marriage, which allowed her to enjoy the benefits of his wealth and status without accepting responsibility for the emotional labor that traditional wives were expected to provide. Margaret dried her hands on a kitchen towel with deliberate slowness, using the extra moments to compose her expression into something that resembled calm acceptance rather than the rage and disgust that threatened to overflow every time she was forced to interact with her husband's mistress. She walked to the foyer where Sophia stood examining her reflection in the antique mirror that had cost more than most people's annual salaries, adjusting her blonde hair with the practiced precision of someone who understood that her appearance was her most valuable asset. Sophia was dressed in a white designer outfit that had probably cost several $1,000s and was clearly intended to project innocence and sophistication simultaneously. Every detail of her presentation had been carefully calculated, from her professionally applied makeup to her strategically chosen jewelry, to the way she held herself with the confidence of someone who had never doubted her own appeal or questioned whether she deserved the luxurious lifestyle her relationship with Richard provided. "Sophia," Margaret said with the neutral politeness she had perfected during months of interactions that felt like diplomatic negotiations between hostile nations. "Richard isn't here at the moment." "I know exactly where Richard is. Darling, I have access to his calendar and his location at all times," Sophia replied with a smile that contained enough sharp edges to cut glass. "I came to see you specifically because I think it's time we establish some new ground rules for our arrangement moving forward." The casual mention of having access to Richard's private information felt like another small violation. Another reminder that Margaret's role in her husband's life had been steadily diminished while Sophia's influence had grown to include areas that should have remained private between married partners. Margaret wondered what other aspects of her marriage had been shared with the woman who was systematically replacing her in Richard's affections and priorities. "What arrangement would that be?" Margaret asked, though she suspected she already knew where this conversation was heading and dreaded hearing it spoken aloud. Sophia laughed with the musical quality that probably charmed men who were susceptible to obvious manipulation techniques. "Oh, please don't be coy with me. We both know that you've been serving as my housekeeper for the past 6 months. Richard told me it was actually your idea, that you wanted to feel useful during this transitional period while he worked through some personal issues. The audacity of the lie was so complete that Margaret almost felt a grudging admiration for its creativity. Richard had somehow convinced his mistress that his wife had volunteered to clean her apartment, transforming systematic humiliation into an act of generous service that reflected well on both his sensitivity to Margaret's emotional needs and her maturity in handling a difficult situation. "Is that the story he told you?" Margaret asked, genuinely curious about how Richard had managed to reframe her forced servitude as evidence of her willing cooperation with his extramarital activities. "Men have such delicate egos about these situations," Sophia continued, settling onto the white leather sofa in the living room without waiting for an invitation, arranging herself with the practiced grace of someone who was accustomed to being admired from every angle. "They need to believe that all the women in their lives are friends, that there's no competition or jealousy or conflict between us. It makes them feel better about their choices and allows them to avoid confronting the emotional complications that come with managing multiple relationships simultaneously." Margaret followed Sophia into the living room, noting how comfortable the younger woman seemed in the space that Margaret had considered home for 23 years. There was something proprietary in the way Sophia moved through the apartment, as if she were already mentally redecorating and planning changes that would better reflect her personal taste and lifestyle preferences. "But since we're both adults who understand how the world actually works," Sophia continued, examining her perfectly manicured nails with the attention most people reserve for important documents, "I thought we should discuss the future more directly and honestly than Richard seems capable of doing." "What aspects of the future did you want to discuss?" Margaret asked, settling into the chair across from Sophia and preparing herself for whatever new form of degradation was about to be proposed. "Well, darling, Richard has explained his timeline for finalizing the divorce proceedings, and I want to make sure we're all on the same page about expectations for the transition period," Sophia said with the tone of someone discussing weekend plans rather than the systematic destruction of a 23-year marriage. "After the legal paperwork is completed and you've moved into more appropriate accommodations, you'll obviously need to establish some form of independent income." The phrase "more appropriate accommodations" hung in the air like a cloud of poisonous gas. Margaret understood that Sophia was referring to whatever minimal housing allowance Richard planned to provide as part of a divorce settlement designed to leave his ex-wife financially dependent, but no longer legally entitled to the lifestyle she had helped build through decades of emotional and social support. "And frankly, given your limited work experience over the past 2 decades," Sophia continued with the false sympathy of someone offering to help solve a problem she had created, "you might want to consider turning your cleaning skills into something more permanent and financially sustainable." The words settled over Margaret like a blanket made of ice. Sophia was casually suggesting that she should become a professional cleaning lady after her divorce from a millionaire ex-husband, as if this represented a reasonable career transition rather than a deliberate attempt to ensure her continued humiliation in social isolation. "Think of it as job training," Sophia said, her voice taking on the tone of someone offering an extraordinarily generous favor. "You're already familiar with my standards and expectations, and I'm willing to provide references to help you build a client base. Several of Richard's business associates have lovely homes that could benefit from regular professional attention." Margaret stared at the woman who was outlining a future in which she would serve as domestic help for the social circle that had once considered her a peer. The casual cruelty of the proposal was breathtaking, but what made it truly devastating was the confidence with which Sophia delivered it, as if she genuinely believed that Margaret should be grateful for the opportunity to become a servant in the homes of people who had once invited her to dinner parties as an equal. "You'll need work experience and references if you want to find employment after the divorce," Sophia continued, apparently oblivious to the impact her words were having. "And let's be completely honest. Darling, what else are you qualified to do at this stage of your life? You've been out of the workforce for decades, and the business world has changed dramatically since you were last professionally active." Ibram. The systematic destruction of Margaret's confidence and prospects was being presented as practical career counseling, as if Sophia were a guidance counselor helping a struggling student identify realistic options rather than a predator planning the complete degradation of her rival. "Richard thinks you'd be perfect for domestic work," Sophia said, delivering the final insult with a smile that suggested she believed she was sharing good news. "You're thorough, discreet, and you already understand the importance of not gossiping about what you observe in people's homes. Plus, You're familiar with the lifestyle expectations of successful people, which would be valuable when working for Richard's social and business circle. Margaret found her voice, though it sounded strange and distant to her own ears. And you discussed this career plan with Richard. Of course, darling. We discuss everything together, Sophia replied. And the casual inclusion of herself in Richard's decision-making process was more damaging than any direct insult could have been. He's very concerned about your successful transition to independence, and we both want to make sure you land on your feet financially. Richard has always spoken so highly of your practical nature and your ability to adapt to changing circumstances. The "we" in that sentence represented the complete erasure of Margaret's role as Richard's primary partner and closest confidant. Sophia and Richard had been planning Margaret's post-divorce future together, mapping out a life that would keep her financially dependent while ensuring that she remained socially isolated and professionally marginalized. How thoughtful of both of you to be so concerned about my welfare, Margaret said, her voice carrying an edge that Sophia was apparently too self-absorbed to detect. I knew you'd understand, Sophia said with obvious satisfaction. You've always been so reasonable about accepting reality, which is what Richard has always admired most about you. You're not one of those wives who creates unnecessary drama when circumstances change. After Sophia left, Margaret stood alone in the living room that no longer felt like her home, surrounded by furniture and art and decorative objects that represented a life she had never really owned. Everything beautiful and valuable in the apartment belonged to Richard, or had been chosen by Richard, or existed because Richard had deemed it appropriate for the image he wanted to project to the world. She walked to the master bathroom and stared at herself in the mirror that reflected back a woman who looked perfectly groomed and appropriately dressed, but whose eyes seemed to belong to someone who had been disappearing by degrees for years. When had she become a woman who accepted being discussed and planned for by other people as if she were property to be disposed of, rather than a person with agency and rights and the capacity to determine her own future? Her phone rang, and Claire's name appeared on the screen like a lifeline thrown to someone drowning in water too deep and dark to escape. Emergency, Margaret said the moment she answered. They want me to become their permanent cleaning lady. It's not just about cleaning Sophia's apartment anymore. They're planning my entire post-divorce career as domestic help for Richard's social circle. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds, and Margaret could practically hear her sister's mind working to process information that was even worse than they had prepared for. We're coming over right now, Claire said with the decisive tone that had built her marketing empire. Richard isn't here, and he won't be back until after 9 tonight, Margaret said, glancing at the calendar that governed their social schedule like a military operation. Good. Diana and I have been analyzing the information we gathered yesterday, and there are some things we need to show you that will change how you think about everything that's been happening. 45 minutes later, both sisters sat in Margaret's living room with their laptops open and expressions that combined fury at Richard's behavior with determination to ensure that his plans for Margaret's future would never come to pass. We need to tell you about something we discovered when we were analyzing Richard's digital communications, Diana said without preamble, her voice carrying the focused intensity of someone who had spent hours uncovering information that revealed the true scope of Richard's systematic planning. The cleaning arrangement with Sophia wasn't spontaneous humiliation or evidence of Richard's midlife crisis. It was carefully designed psychological manipulation intended to establish a legal pattern of your accepting, subservient behavior. Margaret felt the room seem to tilt around her as she processed what Diana was telling her. What do you mean Richard has been building a legal case that you're psychologically dependent on his guidance and direction? Claire explained, pulling up documents on her laptop that looked like legal strategy memos. If he can demonstrate to a divorce court that you willingly performed domestic services for his business associates over an extended period, it supports his argument that you're incapable of independent decision-making and require long-term supervision rather than equal treatment as a competent adult. Which completely changes the divorce settlement calculations, Diana continued, showing Margaret financial projections that painted a devastating picture of her post-divorce prospects under different legal scenarios. Instead of alimony that recognizes your equal contribution to building the wealth you shared during your marriage, you would receive supervised assistance that Richard would control and that could be terminated at his discretion. Margaret stared at her sisters. Finally understanding that every humiliation of the past 6 months had been calculated to destroy not just her emotional stability and self-respect, but her legal standing as an equal partner in the marriage that was about to be dissolved. Every time you cleaned Sophia's apartment, every time you accepted treatment that diminished your status relative to Richard's, you were unknowingly providing evidence that could be used to argue that you're not competent to manage your own financial affairs, Claire explained. Richard's been playing a very sophisticated legal game while making you think you were just trying to save your marriage. But here's what he doesn't know, Diana said with a smile that contained enough satisfaction to power the entire city. We've been playing the same game, and we're much better at it than he is. That night, as Margaret waited for Richard to return from his business dinner, she realized that the woman who had spent 6 months cleaning up other people's messes while her own life fell apart was finally ready to start cleaning house in a completely different way. The cleaning lady was about to become the architect of justice, and Richard Thompson was about to discover that he had seriously underestimated the intelligence and determination of the women he had spent years systematically undervaluing. Diana's technology company occupied 3 full floors of a gleaming glass tower in Lower Manhattan, but her personal office felt more like a military command center than a corporate executive suite. Multiple high-resolution monitors displayed cascading streams of data that looked like digital waterfalls, and the walls were covered with whiteboards containing diagrams and flowcharts that resembled battle plans for a complex strategic operation. Which, Margaret realized as she settled into a chair across from Diana's impressive desk, was exactly what they had become. I've been conducting a comprehensive analysis of Thompson Industries' digital infrastructure for the past 72 hours, Diana said, her fingers moving across 3 separate keyboards with the fluid precision of a concert pianist performing a challenging piece of music. What I've discovered goes far beyond simple insider trading or municipal corruption. We're looking at systematic criminal enterprise that spans multiple jurisdictions and involves dozens of co-conspirators. Claire paced behind Diana's chair with the restless energy of someone whose marketing mind was already developing strategies to leverage whatever information Diana had uncovered. Margaret sat quietly, still processing the previous day's conversation with Sophia and the devastating realization that her months of accepting humiliation had been carefully orchestrated to support Richard's legal strategy for leaving her financially dependent and socially isolated. Richard had returned home the previous evening in an unusually expansive mood that suggested his business dinner had produced profitable results. He hadn't asked about Margaret's day or shown any interest in her emotional state, which was fortunate since she wasn't sure she could have concealed her growing understanding of the scope of his deception and manipulation. Show her the municipal corruption timeline first, Claire said, stopping her pacing to lean over Diana's shoulder and point to specific elements displayed on the main monitor. She needs to understand the scope of what we're dealing with before we get into the more complex financial crimes. Diana pulled up a comprehensive visual representation of Thompson Industries' business relationships with city government over the past 5 years. The display looked like a spider web connecting Richard's company to planning officials, zoning commissioners, city council members, and municipal contractors through a complex network of financial transactions, consulting contracts, and strategic donations. Thompson Industries' success isn't just based on advanced knowledge of development decisions, Diana explained, highlighting specific connections that showed money flowing from Richard's company to various city officials. Richard has been actively purchasing those decisions through a sophisticated bribery system disguised as legitimate business relationships. Margaret leaned forward to study the data more closely, seeing her husband's business empire through completely new eyes. The timeline showed strategic campaign contributions followed immediately by favorable zoning decisions, expensive consulting contracts that preceded development approvals, and luxury travel expenses that corresponded exactly with municipal votes that made Richard's clients millions of dollars. He's not predicting which neighborhoods will be developed, Claire said, pointing to specific examples on the screen. He's directly influencing which areas receive development approval by bribing the officials who make those decisions, then positioning his clients to profit from outcomes that he helped orchestrate through systematic corruption. The scope of the criminal activity was staggering. Margaret had always known that Richard was ambitious and sometimes ruthless in his business dealings, but she had assumed his success came from superior intelligence and strategic thinking. Learning that his achievements were actually built on purchasing government decisions through elaborate bribery schemes felt like discovering that everything she thought she knew about her husband's character was completely false. "There's significantly more," Diana said, switching to another display that showed what appeared to be confidential documents from various competing companies. Thomson Industries has been conducting systematic industrial espionage against smaller competitors, stealing their proprietary research and using that information to undercut their bids and destroy their market position. The new screen showed detailed evidence of corporate hacking operations that had targeted 27 different companies over the past 5 years. Diana had somehow obtained records of illegal computer intrusions, stolen marketing research, and confidential strategic plans that Richard's company had used to systematically destroy businesses that posed competitive threats. "We've been quietly reaching out to some of the victimized companies through carefully established business connections," Claire added, consulting notes on her own laptop. "They're extremely interested in pursuing legal action if we can provide sufficient evidence to support criminal charges and civil lawsuits. The potential financial liability could easily reach into the hundreds of millions of dollars." Margaret felt overwhelmed by the comprehensive nature of Richard's criminal activities. She had been focused on understanding his personal cruelty and manipulation, but her sisters had uncovered evidence of systematic fraud that had damaged dozens of other businesses and potentially hundreds of individual careers. "How is it possible that he's been operating like this for years without being caught?" she asked. "Because he's been extremely careful to compartmentalize his illegal activities across multiple different types of violations," Diana replied, pulling up a new display that showed the various criminal enterprises organized by category: municipal corruption through strategic bribery, industrial espionage through corporate hacking, tax evasion through offshore money laundering, securities fraud through insider trading. Any single category of crime might have gone undetected for years if authorities weren't looking for patterns across his entire operation. But when you analyze all the activities together and map the connections between different types of illegal behavior," Claire continued, "the evidence becomes absolutely overwhelming. Richard Thompson isn't just a successful businessman who occasionally cuts ethical corners. He's a sophisticated criminal who has built his entire professional reputation through systematic fraud." Diana pulled up financial records that revealed a complex international network of offshore accounts, shell companies, and banking arrangements that clearly violated multiple federal laws governing financial disclosure and tax reporting. "The money laundering operation alone could result in decades of federal prison time," she said quietly. "Richard has been systematically hiding income from tax authorities through arrangements that violate international banking regulations and constitute clear evidence of intent to defraud the government." Margaret stared at the financial data, understanding for the first time that the millionaire ex-husband she had been afraid to leave because of his wealth and social connections was actually a criminal whose empire could collapse overnight if the appropriate authorities received the evidence that Diana had compiled. "But there's something else you need to understand," Diana said, her voice taking on an even more serious tone. "Richard has been planning to blame some of his cybercrimes on our companies if he gets caught. He's been systematically creating false digital evidence that would make it appear that Thomson Sisters Enterprises has been hacking Thomson Industries' computer systems." Claire's expression darkened as she pulled up additional information on her laptop. "He's been preparing to frame us for crimes he committed, which means that everything he's done to victimize other people, he was also planning to do to his own wife's family." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning in Diana's office. "He's been planning to destroy your businesses. He's been creating fabricated server logs, false communication records, and fake evidence of computer intrusions that would support criminal charges against both of our companies," Diana explained, showing Margaret examples of the fraudulent evidence Richard had been constructing. If federal investigators started looking into Thomson Industries' activities, Richard was prepared to claim that any illegal computer access came from external hackers working for his wife's sisters rather than from his own internal operations, which would have destroyed our professional reputations and probably resulted in federal prison sentences for industrial espionage, Claire added grimly. "Richard wasn't just planning to leave you financially vulnerable through an unfair divorce settlement. He was also preparing to eliminate your primary sources of emotional and financial support by framing Diana and me for crimes we didn't commit." Margaret stared at her sisters, Understanding that Richard's systematic cruelty extended far beyond their marriage to encompass a deliberate plan to destroy everyone who might help her recover from the divorce he was planning. The man she had loved for 23 years had been preparing to send her sisters to federal prison to ensure that she would have no one to turn to for assistance after he discarded her. But here's what he doesn't know, Diana said with a smile that suggested she had been saving the best information for last. We've been recording his creation of false evidence for months. Every fabricated document, every manipulated server log, every piece of fraudulent evidence he's been preparing to use against us has been automatically copied to our secure servers, which means we have comprehensive proof of his intent to frame us for crimes he committed, Claire added with deep satisfaction. Richard Thompson is about to learn that you don't survive in business by underestimating your opponents, and he has systematically underestimated every woman in his life. Diana pulled up a new screen that showed real-time monitoring of Thompson Industries' computer networks. We've also been tracking his current business activities through the same home network access that he doesn't know we have. Want to see what he's planning for this week? The screen displayed Richard's calendar, email communications, and business documents, painting a picture of ongoing criminal activity that included another major bribery scheme scheduled to close within days. The Henderson development deal that he mentioned to his clients last week involves $17 million in illegal payments to city officials, Diana explained, highlighting specific transactions and communications. If that deal closes as scheduled, it will constitute the largest single act of municipal corruption in New York City history. Margaret felt like she was watching her husband's entire life being dissected by experts who understood his methods better than he understood them himself. The Richard who had seemed so powerful and intimidating just days earlier now looked like a criminal who had been operating successfully only because no one with the right skills had bothered to investigate his activities thoroughly. What do we do with all of this information? She asked, gesturing toward the comprehensive evidence that covered Diana's multiple monitors like a digital indictment. That depends entirely on what kind of outcome you want to achieve, Claire replied, beginning to organize printed copies of the most damaging evidence into files that look like legal documents. We can use this information as leverage to ensure that you receive a divorce settlement that reflects your actual legal rights rather than the minimal support Richard is planning to offer. Or we can provide everything to federal investigators and let Richard face the full legal consequences of his criminal activities. Or we can pursue both approaches simultaneously, Diana said with obvious enthusiasm for the most comprehensive form of justice available. There's no legal requirement that we choose between protecting your financial interests and ensuring that Richard's victims receive justice for the crimes he's committed against them over the years. Margaret looked at the evidence that could potentially send her husband to federal prison for decades, thinking about all the businesses he had destroyed, all the people whose careers had been damaged by his systematic theft and fraud, all the taxpayers who had been cheated by his corruption of municipal government. How quickly could federal investigators act if they received this information? She asked. With evidence this comprehensive and well-documented, they could probably obtain search warrants and make arrests within days, Diana replied. White-collar crime prosecutions usually take months or years to develop because gathering evidence is so difficult, but we've essentially done all their investigative work for them. The challenge will be timing the release of information to maximize the impact while ensuring your safety, Claire added. Richard is going to be extremely dangerous when he realizes that his criminal empire is collapsing. We need to make sure you're protected before he discovers what we've been doing. As they prepared to leave Diana's office, Margaret felt the same sense of power and possibility that had characterized her conversation with her sisters earlier in the week, but magnified by the comprehensive nature of the evidence they had gathered. She was no longer just a woman trying to escape a bad marriage. She was someone who could provide justice for dozens of victims of systematic criminal activity. There's one more thing, Diana said as they gathered their materials. Richard's been planning to accelerate his timeline for filing divorce papers. Based on his communications with his lawyers, he's going to try to finalize everything before the end of this week. Which means we need to move quickly, Claire said. If he files first and establishes the legal framework for the divorce on his terms, it becomes much more difficult to ensure that you receive fair treatment, Margaret nodded, understanding that they had reached the point where careful planning needed to give way to decisive action. The woman who had spent months accepting humiliation while trying to save a marriage that had ended years earlier was about to become the catalyst for bringing down a criminal empire that had victimized dozens of innocent people. "I want to do everything," she said quietly. "I want a fair divorce settlement that recognizes my contribution to our marriage, and I want Richard to face justice for all the people he's hurt over the years. But most importantly, I want to make sure he can never do this to anyone else." Diana and Claire exchanged a look that suggested they had been hoping Margaret would choose the most comprehensive approach to dealing with Richard's crimes. "Then we need to start making phone calls," Claire said with the satisfied expression of someone who had been waiting years for the opportunity to destroy a man who had systematically undervalued and abused her sister. The cleaning lady was about to become the key witness in the largest white-collar crime prosecution in New York City history. But more importantly, Margaret Thompson was finally ready to stop accepting the limited life that other people had planned for her and start building the future she actually deserved. The phone in Margaret's penthouse kitchen began ringing at 6:37 in the morning, the sharp electronic sound cutting through the pre-dawn silence like an alarm announcing the beginning of a war that had been planned for months but was only now moving into its active phase. Margaret was already awake, sitting at the breakfast table with coffee that had grown cold while she rehearsed conversations she would need to have over the next several hours. Conversations that would determine whether Richard's criminal empire would continue victimizing innocent people or would finally face the justice it had avoided for years. The caller ID showed Claire's number, though Margaret had been expecting the call since before sunrise. Her sisters had spent most of the previous evening coordinating with federal investigators, business journalists, and legal experts to ensure that their counterattack against Richard's operations would be comprehensive enough to prevent him from escaping consequences through legal technicalities or political connections. "The FBI wants to move today," Claire said without preamble, her voice carrying the focused intensity of someone who had been awake most of the night managing details that could determine the success or failure of their entire operation. "They've reviewed all the evidence Diana compiled, and they're convinced that waiting any longer could result in Richard destroying documentation or transferring assets to offshore accounts that would be impossible to recover." Margaret felt her stomach clench with a mixture of anticipation and terror. For months, she had been living in a state of suspended animation, accepting degradation while secretly hoping that something would change to restore her marriage to its former state. Now she was about to become the primary catalyst for changing everything, but in ways that would make returning to her previous life completely impossible. "What exactly happens today?" she asked, surprised by how steady her voice sounded when everything inside her felt like it was vibrating with nervous energy. "Multiple coordinated actions across several different fronts," Claire replied, and Margaret could hear papers shuffling as her sister consulted notes that probably contained enough information to fill a legal brief. FBI raids on Thompson Industries offices and several city government buildings, arrests of Richard and his primary co-conspirators, emergency freezing of all business and personal accounts pending investigation, and seizure of electronic records that will provide evidence for prosecutions that could continue for years. Margaret walked to the window that overlooked Central Park, watching early morning joggers and dog walkers beginning their daily routines in a world that seemed completely normal, despite being about to change in ways that would affect dozens of families and businesses throughout the city. "Where is Richard right now?" she asked, realizing that she had no idea whether her husband was still asleep in their bedroom or had already left for the office where federal agents would soon be executing search warrants. According to the electronic surveillance Diana has been maintaining, he left for his office 45 minutes ago for what he thinks is a routine breakfast meeting with potential investors. Claire replied, "He has no idea that the people he's meeting with are actually undercover federal agents who have been building this case for the past week." Margaret felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that Richard would be arrested away from their home, sparing her the trauma of watching federal agents handcuff her husband in their bedroom. Sadness that 23 years of marriage was ending with her husband being led away in handcuffs by law enforcement officers, rather than with the kind of mutual respect and shared memories that should characterize the conclusion of a long relationship. "What do I need to do?" she asked. "For the next several hours, absolutely nothing except stay safe and let federal agents secure all the evidence," Claire replied. "Diana will be coordinating with the FBI's Computer Crimes Unit to ensure that all digital evidence is properly preserved and authenticated. I'll be managing communications with the business journalists who will be reporting on the story to ensure that the coverage focuses on Richard's crimes rather than on personal details about your marriage. And after that, You start building the life you actually want instead of the life that other people have been planning for you. 2 hours later, Margaret sat in her living room watching cable news reports that made her feel like she was observing events happening to someone else rather than experiencing the collapse of her own life's foundation. The television screen showed federal agents carrying boxes of evidence from Thompson Industries offices, while reporters described allegations of municipal corruption and corporate fraud that could result in prison sentences measured in decades rather than years. This is a developing story about what federal prosecutors are calling one of the largest white-collar crime investigations in New York City history. The news anchor announced as footage of Richard being led away in handcuffs played on screen. Richard Thompson, CEO of Thompson Industries, has been arrested on charges including bribery, money laundering, securities fraud, and conspiracy to defraud municipal government. Margaret stared at the image of her husband in handcuffs, trying to reconcile the confident businessman she had been married to for 23 years with the criminal who was now facing federal charges that could keep him in prison for the rest of his life. The Richard on the television screen looked smaller and more vulnerable than the man who had systematically controlled every aspect of her existence for decades. Her phone rang continuously as friends, acquaintances, and reporters attempted to reach her for comments about the arrest. But Margaret had been advised by the federal prosecutors to avoid speaking with anyone except her legal representatives until the investigation was complete. The isolation felt strange after years of being constantly available to manage Richard's social and business relationships, but it also felt like freedom from obligations that had never truly been hers to begin with. Diana arrived at the penthouse in the early afternoon, carrying laptop computers and looking like someone who had been coordinating complex technical operations for hours without rest. "The digital evidence seizure is proceeding better than we hoped," she said, settling into Margaret's living room with the efficient movements of someone managing multiple urgent priorities simultaneously. Richard's attempts to delete files and destroy records have actually provided additional evidence of obstruction of justice and consciousness of guilt. "He's been trying to destroy evidence," Margaret asked, frantically, "for the past 6 hours. Diana replied with obvious satisfaction. "But what he doesn't understand is that deleting files from his office computers doesn't affect the backup copies that have been automatically stored on servers that we've had access to for months. Every document he's tried to destroy has been preserved, and his efforts to eliminate evidence have been recorded as additional criminal activity." Claire joined them an hour later, carrying newspapers and printed articles that showed how quickly the story was spreading through business and political circles throughout the city. "The media coverage is focusing exactly where we want it to focus," she said, spreading the publications across Margaret's coffee table. "Richard's business crimes and political corruption, rather than personal details about your marriage or speculation about your role in the investigation." Margaret examined the headlines that described Richard as a corrupt businessman rather than a husband whose wife had helped expose his crimes. The coverage protected her privacy while ensuring that the focus remained on the systematic nature of Richard's criminal activities and their impact on the broader community. "What's happening with the other people who were arrested?" she asked. "Jim Henderson, Commissioner Walsh, and Councilman Torres are all in federal custody, facing charges that could result in similar prison sentences," Claire replied. "The FBI has been building cases against the entire corruption network for years, but they never had the kind of comprehensive inside access that Diana's monitoring provided." Diana pulled up real-time information on her laptop that showed the continuing investigation expanding to include additional suspects and criminal activities that investigators were discovering as they analyzed the evidence. 23 additional businesses have come forward with evidence that they were victims of Thompson Industries' industrial espionage operations, she said. "The civil lawsuits alone could result in financial judgments that exceed the total value of Richard's business empire." Margaret felt overwhelmed by the scope of justice that was unfolding as a result of her decision to stop accepting treatment that had gradually destroyed her sense of self-worth and agency. Her personal liberation was generating consequences that extended far beyond her own situation to provide justice for dozens of other victims of Richard's systematic criminal activity. "There's something else," Claire said, consulting notes on her phone. "Sophia has been arrested as well. Apparently, she wasn't just Richard's mistress, she was also his primary liaison with several of the businesses that were being targeted for corporate espionage." The news that Sophia was also facing criminal charges provided a strange sense of justice that Margaret hadn't expected to feel. The woman who had treated her as hired help while planning her post-divorce career as a domestic servant was actually a criminal who had been profiting from illegal activities while pretending to be merely Richard's romantic companion. So when she was instructing me on how to clean her apartment, she was actually coordinating computer crimes from the same location. Margaret asked. According to the evidence the FBI seized from her apartment, she was using her relationship with Richard as cover for managing industrial espionage operations that generated millions of dollars in illegal profits. Diana replied, "The apartment you were cleaning was actually a criminal headquarters disguised as a luxury residence." Margaret thought about all the hours she had spent scrubbing bathrooms and changing sheets in a space that was being used to coordinate systematic theft from other businesses, adding another layer of violation to experiences that had already felt degrading beyond description. As evening approached and the initial wave of arrests and evidence seizures concluded, Margaret found herself alone in the penthouse that no longer felt like a prison, but didn't yet feel like home either. The news coverage continued on every channel, but the focus was shifting from breaking news to analysis of the long-term implications of the corruption network that had been exposed. Her phone rang, and she was surprised to see Richard's name on the caller ID. Federal detention centers apparently allowed limited phone access for prisoners who had not yet been convicted, though she couldn't imagine what Richard might want to say to her after everything that had happened. "I underestimated you," he said when she answered, his voice carrying none of the confidence and authority that had characterized their conversations throughout their marriage. "I underestimated all of you. You underestimated women in general," Margaret replied, surprised by how calm she felt. "You thought we were too weak or too dependent or too stupid to fight back effectively. But we weren't weak. We were just waiting for the right moment to remind you that we never needed you to survive. We just chose to include you in our lives, and we can choose to exclude you just as easily. The federal prosecutors are saying I could be looking at 15 to 20 years in prison," Richard said quietly. "I know," Margaret replied. "I also know that the victims of your crimes are finally going to receive justice for what you did to them. I think that's a fair trade." After hanging up, Margaret walked through the penthouse that contained 23 years of shared memories, understanding that this phase of her life was ending, but that she finally had the power to determine what would replace it. The cleaning lady had completed her last day of servitude, but Margaret Thompson's first day of genuine freedom was just beginning. Richard was waiting in the penthouse kitchen when Margaret came down for her morning coffee 3 days after his arrest, his presence so unexpected that she initially thought she might be hallucinating from stress and sleep deprivation. He sat at the breakfast table where they had shared thousands of meals over 23 years of marriage. But everything about him looked different. His usual perfectly styled hair was disheveled. His expensive suit was wrinkled, as if he had slept in it, and his blue eyes carried a desperate intensity that she had never seen before. "How are you here?" Margaret asked, her voice steadier than she felt as she processed the impossibility of Richard's presence in their home when he should have been in federal detention, awaiting trial on charges that could result in decades of imprisonment. "Posted bail 2 hours ago," Richard replied, though his voice lacked the confidence and authority that had characterized every conversation they had conducted throughout their marriage. $5 million secured by assets that the federal government hasn't frozen yet, which gives me a few days of freedom before the trial preparation process begins in earnest. Margaret remained standing near the kitchen entrance, calculating the distance to the nearest exit and wondering whether she should immediately call her sisters or the federal prosecutors who had advised her to avoid contact with Richard while the investigation continued. His presence felt dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with physical threat and everything to do with the psychological manipulation that had controlled her behavior for years. "We need to discuss the terms of our separation," Richard continued, pushing a thick manila folder across the marble surface toward her. "And we need to address whatever misguided campaign of revenge your sisters have been conducting against my business operations." Margaret approached the table cautiously and opened the folder to find photographs of herself entering Thompson Sisters Enterprises, detailed surveillance records of her meetings with Claire and Diana over the past several weeks, and financial documents that appeared to show illegal activity on the part of her sister's companies. "You've been having me followed," she said, though she wasn't particularly surprised by this revelation, given everything else she had learned about Richard's methods and character over the past week. "I've been protecting my interests through appropriate due diligence," Richard corrected, his voice carrying the cold precision that had once intimidated her, but now sounded like the desperate posturing of someone who had lost control of circumstances that were spiraling beyond his ability to manage. And that investigation has revealed some very troubling information about your family's recent business activities. The surveillance photographs showed Margaret's visits to her sister's offices, but they also included images of Claire meeting with executives from companies that competed with Thompson Industries and Diana accessing computer servers that could potentially contain confidential business information belonging to Richard's clients. Industrial espionage and corporate hacking are federal crimes that carry prison sentences of up to 20 years, Richard said, his voice taking on the threatening tone that had been his primary method of controlling her behavior throughout their marriage. Your sisters have been using their business operations as cover for systematic theft of proprietary information from Thompson Industries and our client companies. Margaret stared at the documents, understanding that Richard was attempting to transform himself from perpetrator to victim by claiming that her sisters were responsible for the very crimes that federal investigators had arrested him for committing. Diana's cybersecurity company provides legitimate protective services, Margaret said carefully, though she wasn't certain how far Richard's desperation might lead him or what additional evidence he might have fabricated to support his accusations. Not when they're using those legitimate services as cover for illegal infiltration of confidential computer systems, Richard replied, pulling out his phone to show her a contact list that included federal investigators, prosecutors, and law enforcement officials. I have digital forensics experts who can prove that Thompson Sisters Enterprises has been systematically accessing Thompson Industries' protected files for months. The threat was clear if Margaret's sisters continued their investigation into Richard's business practices. He would use his remaining resources and connections to have them arrested for the same crimes that had already landed him in federal custody. "You're bluffing," Margaret said, though she wasn't entirely confident about her assessment of Richard's current capabilities or the extent to which federal authorities might believe claims supported by fabricated evidence. Richard pulled out additional documents that appeared to show electronic communications between Diana's company and Thompson Industries' computer systems, financial transfers that suggested payment for stolen information, and technical analyses that would support criminal charges for corporate espionage and computer fraud. "One phone call. Margaret," he said, holding up his phone like a weapon aimed at her family. "One conversation with the right federal prosecutor, and your sisters lose everything they've spent years building. Their companies, their professional reputations, their freedom, their financial security, all of it disappears permanently." Margaret felt the familiar weight of fear settling over her shoulders, the same psychological pressure that had controlled her decisions for years and had led her to accept treatment that had gradually eroded her sense of self-worth and agency. Richard was using the threat of destroying her sisters to force her back into compliance with his expectations and demands. "What exactly do you want from me?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew what kind of bargain Richard was preparing to propose. "I want you to sign the divorce papers that my attorneys filed yesterday," Richard said, producing another set of legal documents from his briefcase with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been planning this conversation for days. "I want you to accept the settlement terms without negotiation or legal challenge. And most importantly, I want you to convince your sisters to cease their investigation into my business activities and to return any proprietary information they may have obtained through their illegal infiltration of my company's computer systems." Margaret examined the divorce papers, noting that the settlement terms were significantly worse than even the minimal support she had overheard him discussing with his business associates the previous week. The prenuptial agreement was being interpreted in the most restrictive possible manner, leaving her with barely enough financial support to maintain a middle-class lifestyle and no claim whatsoever to business assets that she had helped build through decades of social and emotional support. "This settlement doesn't provide enough support for me to maintain even basic financial security," she said. "Financial security is earned through productive work, not granted through legal entitlements." Richard replied with the casual cruelty that had characterized his treatment of her throughout the deterioration of their marriage. "The terms are generous considering your lack of direct contribution to the business operations that generated our wealth, and they're far more favorable than what you would receive if your sister's criminal activities result in additional legal complications." Margaret stared at the man she had loved for over 2 decades, wondering when he had become someone capable of such systematic psychological violence against people who had never caused him any harm except by refusing to accept abuse without resistance. "I need time to review these documents and consult with legal counsel," she said. "You have until 5 o'clock this afternoon," Richard replied, standing and straightening his tie with the same meticulous precision he had always brought to grooming and presentation, as if maintaining perfect appearance could somehow restore his control over circumstances that had moved far beyond his influence. "After that deadline, I make the phone calls that will end your sisters' careers and result in federal charges that will destroy their lives as comprehensively as they have attempted to destroy mine." After Richard left for meetings with his legal team, Margaret sat alone in the kitchen that had been the site of countless conversations throughout their marriage. Most of them focused on Richard's business activities and social obligations, with minimal attention paid to her thoughts, feelings, or independent existence. Now the space felt like a battlefield where the final confrontation of their relationship was being planned and executed. Her phone rang, and Claire's number appeared on the screen like a lifeline, connecting her to people who actually cared about her welfare, rather than viewing her as an asset to be managed or a problem to be solved. "We know about Richard's threats," Claire said immediately, her voice carrying the calm confidence of someone who had been expecting exactly this kind of desperate retaliation. "Diana's been monitoring his communications since he was released on bail. We saw him hiring private investigators to surveil you and fabricate evidence that could be used against us. He has documents that appear to show your companies illegally accessing his computer systems," Margaret said, feeling somewhat foolish for worrying about threats that her sisters had apparently anticipated and prepared for. "All of that evidence is fabricated." Diana's voice joined the conversation on speakerphone, carrying the technical authority of someone who understood exactly how digital fraud was constructed and detected. "What Richard doesn't realize is that we've been recording his creation of false evidence for the past 6 months. Every forged document, every manipulated server log, every piece of fraudulent evidence he's prepared to use against us has been automatically copied to our secure systems." Margaret felt a surge of relief mixed with admiration for her sister's strategic thinking and technical capabilities. "So his threats are meaningless. His threats are actually additional evidence of criminal intent and systematic dishonesty that federal prosecutors will use to enhance his prison sentence," Claire replied with obvious satisfaction. "The man who spent decades teaching people that information is power is about to learn that lesson applies when you're on the receiving end of superior intelligence gathering." "There's something else," Diana added. "The federal prosecutors have been monitoring Richard's activities since his release on bail. His attempts to threaten witnesses and obstruct justice have been recorded and will result in additional criminal charges that could add years to his eventual prison sentence." Margaret realized that while she had been feeling threatened and vulnerable, Richard had actually been walking deeper into legal traps that would ensure his imprisonment for decades rather than years. His desperation was making him sloppy in ways that would provide additional evidence for prosecutors who already had more than enough information to convict him of dozens of serious federal crimes. "What should I do about the divorce papers?" she asked. "Ignore them completely," Claire replied. "Richard has no legal standing to make demands about divorce settlements while he's facing federal criminal charges that will result in the seizure of most of his assets. Any divorce agreement signed under these circumstances would be invalidated by courts as soon as his criminal trial concludes. More importantly," Diana added, "federal prosecutors want to use Richard's threats against you as evidence of witness intimidation and obstruction of justice. They've asked us to document every contact he makes with you so they can use his behavior to support additional charges." At 5 o'clock that afternoon, Margaret called Richard from the Thompson Sisters Enterprises conference room, surrounded by her sisters and feeling stronger than she had in years. "Have you made your decision about the settlement terms?" Richard asked, his voice carrying the expectation of compliance that had controlled her behavior for decades. "I've decided to stop being afraid of you," Margaret replied, looking at Claire and Diana and feeling supported by people who actually cared about her welfare rather than viewing her as property to be managed. "I've decided to stop accepting threats from someone who thinks intimidation is a substitute for genuine strength." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds, and Margaret could practically hear Richard's mind racing to process the reality that his primary method of controlling her behavior was no longer effective. "You're making a serious mistake," Richard said finally, his voice carrying a note of panic that suggested he was beginning to understand that his desperate gambit had failed completely. A very expensive mistake that will have consequences for everyone you care about. The only mistake I made was spending 23 years accepting treatment that no one should accept from someone who claims to love them, Margaret replied. But that mistake ends today, and it will never be repeated. As she hung up the phone, Margaret realized that the woman who had spent months cleaning up other people's messes while her own life fell apart was finally ready to take control of her own story and write the ending she actually deserved. The first emergency news alert appeared on Margaret's phone at 6:47 in the morning, followed immediately by a second alert, then a third, until her device was buzzing continuously with notifications about breaking developments in what news organizations were calling the largest municipal corruption scandal in New York City history. She was sitting at the window of her penthouse bedroom, watching the sunrise paint Central Park in shades of gold and orange, while drinking coffee that actually tasted good for the first time in months, when the cascade of alerts began. Federal investigators have expanded their investigation into Thompson Industries to include additional charges of witness intimidation and obstruction of justice. The first news alert read, Richard Thompson, already facing decades in prison for bribery and fraud, now faces additional charges that could result in a life sentence. Margaret opened her laptop and began following live news coverage that showed a level of law enforcement activity she had never imagined possible. FBI agents were executing search warrants at dozens of locations throughout the city, arresting co-conspirators whose names she recognized from years of dinner parties and social events, seizing assets from businesses and individuals who had participated in Richard's corruption network. The television in her bedroom displayed footage of federal agents carrying boxes of evidence from city government offices, while reporters described the systematic dismantling of what prosecutors called a criminal enterprise that had corrupted municipal government for over a decade. The scale of the investigation had expanded far beyond anything Margaret had anticipated when she first decided to stop accepting humiliation and start fighting for basic dignity and respect. Her phone rang, and Diana's name appeared on the screen along with a message that said, "Turn on Channel 7 News immediately." "Are you watching the coverage?" Diana asked when Margaret answered. "I'm watching several channels simultaneously," Margaret replied, using her laptop to monitor multiple news feeds while the television provided background coverage of arrests and asset seizures throughout the city. "This is much bigger than we thought it would be." The federal prosecutors decided to move against the entire corruption network at once to prevent co-conspirators from destroying evidence or fleeing the country. Diana explained, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone whose strategic planning had contributed to achieving justice on a scale that exceeded their most optimistic projections. "They're calling it the largest single-day white-collar crime operation in federal law enforcement history." Margaret watched footage of Richard being transferred from federal detention to a high-security facility, his usual confident bearing replaced by the defeated posture of someone who finally understood that his legal situation was hopeless. The man who had controlled every aspect of her life for decades looked small and vulnerable as federal marshals escorted him through crowds of reporters shouting questions about crimes that had enriched him while damaging hundreds of other people. "Thompson Industries stock is in complete freefall." Claire's voice joined the conference call, carrying the tone of someone who had been monitoring financial markets since before dawn. "The company's market value has dropped by 92% since trading opened this morning, and the Securities and Exchange Commission has halted all trading pending investigation of securities fraud." Margaret pulled up financial news coverage that showed Thompson Industries' stock price collapsing in real time as investors realized that the company's profits had been generated through systematic criminal activity rather than legitimate business operations. The business empire that Richard had spent decades building was being dismantled by market forces and regulatory authorities, working in coordination to ensure that none of his criminal profits could be preserved. "What's happening with the other people who were arrested?" Margaret asked. "Jim Henderson has already agreed to cooperate with federal prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence," Diana replied, consulting information that appeared to be flowing continuously from multiple sources. "Commissioner Walsh and Councilman Torres are both facing charges that could result in decades of imprisonment, and at least 15 other city officials have been arrested for accepting bribes from Thompson Industries." The scope of the corruption network was staggering. Margaret had known that Richard's business involved questionable relationships with government officials, but she hadn't understood that he had been systematically bribing municipal employees at every level of city government to influence decisions that affected the lives of millions of New York residents. The civil lawsuits are going to be even more devastating than the criminal charges, Claire added, her marketing expertise allowing her to understand the long-term implications of reputational damage that extended far beyond immediate legal consequences. 37 businesses have filed suit against Thompson Industries for industrial espionage, and the city government is considering legal action to recover damages from decades of corrupted development decisions. Margaret felt overwhelmed by the scale of justice that was unfolding as a consequence of her decision to stop accepting degradation and start fighting for basic human dignity. Her personal liberation had generated a chain reaction that was providing justice for hundreds of victims of Richard's systematic criminal activities. "There's something else you need to know," Diana said, her voice taking on a more serious tone. "Sophia's cooperation with federal prosecutors has revealed additional criminal activities that we didn't know about. Apparently, Richard's corruption network extended to businesses in 3 other states and involved crimes that go back more than 15 years. The news that Sophia was providing evidence against Richard felt like poetic justice to Margaret. The woman who had treated her as hired help while planning her post-divorce career as a domestic servant was now helping federal prosecutors ensure that Richard would spend the rest of his life in prison for crimes that had enriched both of them while victimizing countless innocent people. So when she was giving me instructions about cleaning her apartment, she was actually coordinating interstate criminal activities," Margaret asked. According to her testimony, the apartment you were cleaning served as a coordination center for corporate espionage operations that targeted businesses throughout the northeastern United States. Diana replied, "The FBI has been able to identify over 100 companies that were victimized by criminal activities that were planned and coordinated from that location." Margaret thought about all the hours she had spent scrubbing floors and cleaning bathrooms in a space that was being used as a criminal headquarters, adding another dimension of violation to experiences that had already felt degrading beyond description. Every surface she had cleaned had been contaminated by planning sessions for crimes that had destroyed other people's livelihoods and dreams. As the day progressed, the news coverage shifted from breaking developments to analysis of the long-term implications of what commentators were calling the complete collapse of the Thompson criminal empire. Federal prosecutors held a press conference to announce that their investigation had uncovered evidence of systematic criminal activity spanning more than a decade and involving hundreds of separate illegal transactions. This investigation has revealed a level of municipal corruption that threatens the basic integrity of democratic government. The lead federal prosecutor announced to a room full of reporters and cameras that would carry his words to audiences throughout the country. The defendants used their wealth and influence to systematically purchase government decisions that should have been made in the public interest, defrauding taxpayers and legitimate businesses while enriching themselves through criminal conspiracy. Margaret watched the press conference while sitting in the living room that had been the site of countless dinner parties where Richard had entertained the same government officials who were now being arrested for accepting his bribes. She realized that every social event she had hosted, every meal she had served, every conversation she had facilitated had been providing cover for criminal activities that had damaged the fundamental integrity of municipal government. Her phone rang, and she was surprised to see Richard's number appear on the screen. Federal detention facilities apparently allowed prisoners to make limited phone calls, though she couldn't imagine what Richard might want to discuss after everything that had happened. "I want you to know that I never intended for things to go this far," he said when she answered, his voice carrying none of the authority and confidence that had characterized their conversations throughout their marriage. The business activities, the corruption charges, the systematic nature of what prosecutors are describing, none of that was supposed to become public knowledge. "Sorry, but all of it was real," Margaret replied, surprised by how detached she felt from the man whose voice had once had the power to control her emotions and behavior. "Everything prosecutors are describing actually happened, regardless of whether you intended for people to find out about it. The federal sentencing guidelines are suggesting that I could spend the rest of my life in prison," Richard said quietly. "Decades of imprisonment for business decisions that seemed reasonable at the time they were made. What seemed reasonable to you was systematic criminal activity that damaged hundreds of other people's lives," Margaret replied, thinking about all the businesses that had been destroyed by Richard's theft and fraud, all the taxpayers who had been cheated by his corruption of municipal government. The prosecutors aren't punishing you for business decisions. They're ensuring that you face consequences for choices that victimized innocent people for years. I know you worked with your sisters to provide evidence to federal investigators, Richard said, and Margaret could hear acceptance in his voice rather than the anger she had expected. I know that my arrest was the result of a coordinated investigation that used information from our home network and my personal communications. I know that you spent months planning to frame Claire and Diana for crimes you committed, Margaret replied. I know that you were prepared to send my sisters to federal prison to ensure that I would have no support system after you discarded me like outdated equipment. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds, and Margaret realized that Richard was finally confronting the full scope of his cruelty and the comprehensive nature of his criminal activity. You won, he said finally, his voice carrying a note of respect that she had never heard from him during their marriage. You and your sisters outplayed me completely. We didn't win anything, Margaret replied, looking out at Central Park where normal people were living normal lives while her husband's criminal empire collapsed around them. We just stopped accepting treatment that no one should accept from people who claim to care about them. Justice isn't winning, it's just justice. After ending the call, Margaret realized that she felt neither satisfaction nor sadness about Richard's situation. The man who had systematically destroyed her sense of self-worth over decades of marriage was facing the consequences of his own choices. And those consequences had nothing to do with her personal vindication and everything to do with ensuring that his victims finally received justice. The cleaning lady had completed her last day of servitude, but more importantly, Margaret Thompson had finally learned to demand treatment that reflected her actual worth, rather than accepting whatever minimal consideration other people were willing to provide. 6 months after Richard's arrest and conviction, Margaret Thompson sat at the window of her new apartment overlooking the Hudson River, watching the late morning light dance across the water while her coffee grew cool in her hands. The apartment was significantly smaller than the penthouse, with none of the marble or crystal that had defined her previous life. But every piece of furniture had been chosen by her. Every book on the shelves reflected her actual interests rather than Richard's decorator's vision of intellectual sophistication, and every morning brought the quiet satisfaction of waking up in a space that belonged entirely to her. The doorbell chimed with a simple, pleasant sound that bore no resemblance to the elaborate musical sequence that had announced visitors to the penthouse. Margaret smiled as she heard the familiar voices of her sisters in the hallway, punctuated by the sound of paper bags and coffee cups being arranged with the efficiency of people who had made this visit dozens of times over the past several months. Wednesday morning breakfast had evolved into a cherished tradition, a weekly celebration of survival and new beginnings that felt more valuable than any of the elaborate social events that had filled Margaret's calendar during her marriage. The ritual represented something that had been missing from her life for years, regular contact with people who cared about her welfare without expecting anything in return, except the opportunity to maintain their relationship. The final divorce settlement documentation should be processed by the end of this week, Claire announced as she settled into Margaret's small kitchen with the confidence of someone who had helped choose every appliance and who felt genuinely at home in the space. Equal division of all legitimate assets, full restitution for funds that were hidden in offshore accounts, and comprehensive protection against any future claims on your property or income. The federal prosecutors were extraordinarily motivated to ensure that you received fair compensation, Diana added, opening her laptop to display financial documents that represented months of complex negotiations between lawyers, federal agencies, and international banking authorities. Recovering stolen money and returning it to victims makes their conviction statistics look excellent, and your case helped them establish legal precedents for similar situations. Margaret poured coffee for her sisters, still amazed by how different her life looked when viewed through the lens of actual choice rather than obligation imposed by other people's expectations and demands. The financial settlement would leave her comfortably wealthy rather than struggling to survive on minimal support. But more importantly, it would leave her free to determine how that wealth was used to build the life she actually wanted, rather than the life Richard had planned for her. Thompson Industries has been completely dissolved, Diana continued, switching between different screens that showed the final disposition of Richard's business empire. All legitimate assets were liquidated to provide restitution to victims of the criminal activities, and Meridian Technologies has hired most of the employees who weren't involved in the corruption. The people who built the authentic parts of the company didn't lose their jobs because of Richard's crimes. Margaret felt a surge of relief that had been building for months. One of her greatest concerns during the federal investigation had been that innocent employees would suffer for their employer's criminal activities. Learning that they had been protected while the criminal enterprise was dismantled felt like a final piece of justice being properly balanced. And the criminal proceedings, Margaret asked, though she had been following news coverage of Richard's sentencing and the trials of his co-conspirators with the detached interest of someone observing events that no longer had the power to affect her daily existence. Richard's final sentence was 18 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for 12 years. Claire replied with the satisfaction of someone whose strategic planning had contributed to achieving comprehensive justice. Full restitution to all identified victims, cooperation with ongoing investigations into municipal corruption, and forfeiture of all assets that were purchased with criminal proceeds? Margaret nodded, feeling the complex mixture of emotions that had characterized her response to Richard's legal situation throughout the past 6 months. Relief that the ordeal was finally concluded, sadness for the waste of so many lives and opportunities, and quiet pride in the strength she had discovered when forced to defend herself and the people she loved against systematic abuse and manipulation. Her phone rang, displaying a number she didn't recognize but had been expecting based on referrals from the divorce support network where she had been volunteering her time and expertise. "Mrs. Thompson, this is Amanda Chen. I received your contact information from the Women's Legal Aid Organization. I understand that you provide consultation services for women who are navigating complex divorce situations." Margaret had started consulting with women facing difficult divorces 4 months earlier. Using her experience with Richard's financial manipulation and psychological abuse to help others recognize similar patterns in their own relationships and develop strategies for protecting themselves legally and emotionally. The work felt like the first truly meaningful contribution she had made to the world in years. "I do provide those services," Margaret replied, gesturing for her sisters to continue their conversation while she took the call in the living room. "Can you tell me about your specific situation?" "My husband has been systematically convincing me that I'm too emotionally unstable and financially naive to handle our family's business affairs," Amanda said, her voice carrying the hollow, defeated tone that Margaret remembered from her own worst periods of self-doubt and confusion. "He controls all our accounts and investments, and he says I should be grateful that he handles everything, because I'm not intelligent enough to understand business concepts. But I have an MBA from Wharton, and I used to be a financial analyst before we got married 15 years ago." Margaret felt the familiar surge of anger at the systematic way some people diminish their partner's capabilities and achievements in order to maintain control and dominance in relationships that should have been characterized by mutual respect and support. "The hardest part of situations like yours isn't usually the practical aspects of leaving," she said gently, drawing on months of experience helping women remember their own strength and intelligence. "The hardest part is remembering that you were always smart enough and capable enough to make your own decisions. You just got involved with someone who needed you to forget your capabilities in order to feel powerful himself." The conversation continued for 35 minutes, with Margaret providing practical advice about financial discovery procedures, legal representation strategies, and emotional support resources that could help Amanda navigate the process of reclaiming her independence and self-determination. When she finished the call, she realized that Claire and Diana had been quietly listening while continuing their own conversation, their expressions reflecting the mixture of pride and satisfaction that characterized all their discussions about Margaret's consulting work. "How many women have you helped now?" Diana asked, consulting notes on her laptop that apparently tracked the growth and impact of Margaret's informal counseling services. 23 over the past 4 months, Margaret replied, feeling a sense of accomplishment that was completely different from anything she had experienced during her marriage. And every single one of them turned out to be significantly more intelligent and capable than she had been allowed to remember during her relationship. Claire reached across the small table and squeezed Margaret's hand with the warmth of someone who had watched her sister transform from victim to advocate over the course of less than a year. "You know what I think," she said. I think you've finally discovered your actual calling in life. Not as someone's wife or someone's domestic coordinator, but as someone who teaches women to recognize their own worth and refuse to accept treatment that diminishes their fundamental dignity as human beings. Margaret looked at her sisters, women who had built ethical business empires through intelligence, determination, and mutual support rather than through exploitation and criminal activity. For years during her marriage, she had felt like the failure among the three sisters, the one who had chosen dependence over independence and security over authentic achievement. Now she understood that she had simply been preparing for a different kind of strength and a different form of contribution to the world. I've been developing plans to expand the consulting work into something more comprehensive and systematic, she said, pulling a folder from her desk that contained business plans and organizational charts she had been refining over the past several weeks. A nonprofit foundation that provides complete support services for women who are leaving emotionally or financially abusive relationships. Legal assistance, financial planning, career counseling, emotional support, childcare resources, temporary housing if necessary. Everything I wish had been available when I first realized that my marriage had become a prison. The Margaret Thompson Foundation for Women's Economic Independence, Diana suggested, reading over the preliminary documentation with the analytical attention she brought to evaluating new business ventures. We could provide startup funding and organizational support, Claire added, her marketing expertise immediately identifying opportunities to scale the services and reach women who were currently suffering in isolation. Consider it an investment in preventing other people from experiencing what you went through. Margaret smiled, imagining an organization that could transform her personal experience of victimization and recovery into a systematic resource for helping other women recognize their own strength and build lives that reflected their actual capabilities rather than other people's limitations and expectations. As her sisters prepared to leave for their respective offices, Margaret sat at her desk where she had been working on a memoir about her experience with financial and emotional abuse in marriage. The book would detail the systematic way psychological manipulation had nearly destroyed her sense of self, and how the support of her family had helped her reclaim her agency and independence. But more importantly, it would serve as a practical guide for other women who were facing similar situations and who needed to understand that they had more options and more strength than they had been allowed to believe. She opened the document and read the final paragraph she had written the previous evening. We teach people how to treat us through what we accept and what we reject, through the standards we maintain and the behavior we refuse to tolerate. For 23 years, I accepted treatment that diminished my worth because I was afraid of losing what I thought I needed to survive. But I learned that the most dangerous person in anyone's life is often the one who has convinced them that they couldn't survive independently. The truth is that we are all stronger and more capable than we allow ourselves to remember. Sometimes we just need someone to remind us that we were never as powerless as we were told, and that we always had the ability to choose dignity over security, authentic love over comfortable familiarity, and genuine respect over the illusion of being protected by someone who was actually limiting our potential. Margaret saved the document and opened a new email to her literary agent, a woman Claire had recommended who specialized in memoirs that could provide practical guidance for readers facing similar challenges. The book would be published within the year, adding her voice to the growing number of women who were refusing to be diminished by people who claimed to love them, while systematically destroying their confidence in independence. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Richard, his first direct communication since his sentencing hearing 3 months earlier. Federal prison regulations allowed limited electronic communication privileges for inmates who maintain good behavior, and Margaret had chosen not to block his number because she wanted to monitor any attempts at continued manipulation or intimidation. I've been thinking about our last conversation and the things you said about justice and consequences. I think you were right about most of it. I hope the foundation you're planning helps people avoid the mistakes I made and the pain I caused. Margaret stared at the message for several minutes, feeling complicated emotions that arose whenever she remembered moments of genuine connection with the man Richard had been before he became the person whose criminal activities had damaged so many lives. There had been authentic love between them during the early years of their marriage, shared dreams and mutual support that made his systematic betrayal more painful rather than less. She typed a brief response. I hope prison provides you with time to become someone worth becoming. I hope you use that time well. After sending the message, Margaret blocked Richard's number permanently. That chapter of her life was finally completely irreversibly closed. She returned to her desk and began developing a comprehensive business plan for the foundation, outlining services that could provide holistic support for women transitioning from dependence to independence in situations where they had been systematically discouraged from recognizing their own capabilities and worth. Legal assistance, financial planning, career development, emotional counseling, networking opportunities, childcare support, everything necessary to help women rebuild lives that reflected their authentic potential rather than other people's limitations. As the afternoon sun slanted through her windows, Margaret realized that she was building something that could have impact far beyond her own recovery, something that could prevent other women from spending years accepting treatment that diminished their fundamental worth as human beings, while they convinced themselves that patience and accommodation would eventually restore relationships that had actually ended long before they were informed. The sound of her keyboard clicking filled the quiet apartment, each word representing a small act of construction in a life that finally belonged entirely to her. Outside her window, the Hudson River continued its ancient flow toward the ocean, carrying away debris from yesterday while making space for whatever would come tomorrow. Margaret Thompson, former wife, former cleaning lady, current architect of her own destiny and advocate for women who deserve better than they had been taught to expect, worked steadily through the afternoon. She was building a future, one carefully chosen word at a time, constructing tomorrow from the foundation of strength she had discovered when she finally stopped accepting less than she deserved. The sound of breaking crystal had become the sound of beginning. The cleaning lady's last day had become the first day of everything else, and Margaret Thompson was finally, completely, authentically free to become whoever she decided to be. The story ended not with revenge or dramatic confrontation, but with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had learned to demand treatment that reflected her actual worth. She had discovered that the most powerful form of resistance was simply refusing to accept limitations that other people tried to impose, and that the most meaningful victory was helping other people discover their own capacity for building lives that honored their authentic capabilities rather than other people's fears and insecurities. In her new apartment overlooking the Hudson River, surrounded by books she had chosen and furniture that reflected her actual preferences, Margaret Thompson began writing the next chapter of a story that belonged entirely to her. The cleaning lady had completed her last day of servitude, but the architect of justice was just getting started.